Hey guys, tonight we are taking a little trip back in time. Not to a grand palace or a famous battlefield, but to a regular, everyday street in the 17th century. Our mission is simple: to get a tiny little scratch on our hand and then try to get it healed. Sounds straightforward, right? Well, let's just say that in the world you're about to enter, the cure was often far more bizarre, and frankly more interesting, than the injury itself. You're about to land in a time when science and magic weren't just neighbors, they were roommates who borrowed each other's clothes, unfinished each other's sentences. It's a world where you could be considered a genius and a complete quack in the very same breath. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments what city you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't wake up all at once. There's no blaring alarm, no gentle chime from your phone. The process is slow, like a boat drifting towards the shore. First, there's the light. It's a weak, grey, watery light, filtering through what seems to be a single, small opening somewhere to your left. It's just enough to give shapes to the shadows, but not enough to chase them away. The second thing you notice is the cold. It's not the crisp, dry cold of modern air conditioning. This is a deep, damp cold that seems to have soaked into the very fabric of the room. You feel it on your cheeks, your nose, and through the thin, coarse blanket covering you. You pull it tighter, and a faint, musty smell of woolen dust rises up. You shift your weight, and the surface beneath you rustles and crackles. You reach down with one hand. It's not a memory foam mattress. It's a sack, lumpy and uneven, stuffed with what feels like straw. A few sharp pins poke through the fabric, pricking your fingers. This is your bed. It's a world away from comfort, but it's what people have known for centuries. Now you open your eyes fully and sit up. The room is small, smaller than you expected. The ceiling is low, with thick, dark wooden beams just above your head. The walls are a rough, uneven plaster, and the floor is made of wide, wooden planks, scarred with age. There's a small, three-legged stool in the corner, a wooden chest at the foot of your straw mattress, and a stone hearth that is dark and cool, a small mountain of grey ash sitting in its belly. A sound from outside draws your attention. It's a distant, metallic clanging, a church bell, maybe. Then, closer, the distinct sound of a rooster crowing, insistent and proud, followed by the clatter of wood on stone. The world outside is waking up. You swing your legs out of bed, and your bare feet meet the shocking cold of the floorboards. You're wearing a simple, long linen shirt, or a shift. It's your nightgown, your undershirt, and your pajamas all in one. You stand up and stretch, the cold air clinging to your skin. The silence in the room is different from modern silence. It's not the absence of noise, it's a canvas on which small, distinct sounds are painted. You can hear the scuttling of a mouse in the walls, the sigh of the wind through a crack in the window shutter. This brings up a small, fascinating detail that historians who study pre-industrial life often discuss: the concept of sleep itself. Many people didn't sleep in one solid 8-hour block. Instead, they had what's known as segmented sleep. You go to bed shortly after dusk, sleep for about 4 hours, and then wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night. This wasn't considered insomnia, it was a normal, useful part of the night. People would use this quiet, dark time to think, pray, do small chores by candlelight, or simply lie in bed and contemplate the universe. Then, you would go back for your second sleep until dawn. The exact nature of this experience, and how universal it was, is still a topic of gentle debate among historians, but it reframes the whole idea of a good night's sleep. You walk to the window. It's not glass. It's a wooden shutter that you push open onto creaking leather hinges. The morning air that rushes in is a complex cocktail of smells. There's the sharp, pleasant scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's newly lit fire. But underneath that is something else. The damp, earthy smell of a muddy street. The faint but unmistakable tang of animal dung. And the sour note of refuse that was likely tossed from a window just a few hours ago. You lean out and look down. The street is narrow, cobbled, and slick with a thin layer of grime. The houses on the other side are timber-framed. Their upper floors leaning out over the street, almost close enough to touch your own. It feels both intimate and claustrophobic. The day is just beginning. You are here, in the early 17th century, a stranger in a strange land, completely unaware that the simplest of accidents could lead you to one of the most absurd medical adventures in history. For now, don't. You just shiver in the cold morning air and wonder what you're supposed to do for breakfast. The thought of breakfast is what finally motivates you to move. You find your way out of the small bedroom and into the main living space. It's one large room that seems to serve as a kitchen, dining room, and workshop all at once. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke now, as someone, perhaps the woman of the house, is tending to the fire in the main hearth. A large black cauldron hangs from a hook over the flames, bubbling slowly. The contents are a mystery, but it smells vaguely of oats and maybe onions. She gestures towards a rough-hewn table where a loaf of dark, dense-looking bread sits next to a block of pale cheese. This is it. This is breakfast. There's no orange juice, no coffee machine, just the basics. You take a small, sharp knife, its handle worn smooth with use and saw off a hunk of bread. It's tough and chewy, but it's filling. Your day, as it turns out, is not one of leisure. You're expected to help. Your first task is to fetch more water. You're handed to wooden buckets and pointed towards the back door, out in a small, muddy yard. There's a stone well with a simple wooden winch. The work is hard. The rope is rough on your hands, and the buckets, full of sloshing, icy water, all heavy, on your third trip. As you're resetting one of the buckets down on the stone floor of the kitchen, it happens. A sharp, stinging pain in the palm of your hand. You hiss and drop the bucket, a little water splashing onto your boots. You look down. It's not a big injury. It's almost laughable. A long, thin piece of wood, a splinter from the rough, where the bucket handle has driven itself deep into the fleshy part of your palm. You pull it out, wincing, and a single, perfect bead of bright red blood wells up from the tiny wound. In your 21st century mind, the reaction is automatic: run it under some tap water, maybe put on a bandage, and forget about it in 5 minutes. But here, now, a different feeling begins to creep in. A cold, pricking dread that starts in your stomach and spreads outwards. You look at the tiny wound, and you don't just see a splinter, you see a gateway. This is the central, terrifying reality of life before germ theory. People didn't die from episodes of wounds nearly as often as they died from a moment of carelessness. A nick from a shaving razor, a scrape from a fall in the cobbles, a cut from a kitchen knife, or a simple splinter from a wooden bucket. These were the silent assassins of the age. They knew the outcome, even if they didn't know the cause. They saw the pattern. A small, insignificant wound would, a day or two later, become hot and swollen. It would begin to throb with a dull, insistent tape. Then the redness would spread, sometimes with terrifying speed, creeping up a limb like a crimson tide. This was followed by fever, chills, and weakness. In their language, it was a putrefaction, a mortification, a blood poisoning. They had 100 names for it, all of which meant the body was failing, turning against itself, all because of a tiny break in the skin. And this brings us to a specific, and rather nasty, little piece of trivia about the era: the danger of pewter. Many household items for those who could afford them: plates, tankards, spoons were made of pewter. The thing is, 17th century pewter was often stabilized with lead. Over time, Acidic foods and drinks would leach small amounts of lead into the diet. This led to chronic, low-grade lead poisoning, causing a host of health problems that they had no way of diagnosing. But more acutely, if you got a cut and happened to be handling these common items, you were introducing a potent toxin directly into your bloodstream. A simple meal could inadvertently turn a small wound into a fatal one. So you stand there, in the middle of the smoky kitchen, staring at the little red dot on your hand. The woman of the house sees your expression. She comes over, clicks her tongue, and dabs at it with the corner of a not very clean cloth. "I care. Now," she says, her voice not unkind, but heavy with a kind of weary acceptance. It's the voice of someone who has seen this play out a dozen times before. And this is where historians still debate the internal, emotional reality of the 17th century person. We see the statistics, the shockingly high rates of infant mortality and death from infection, and we assume people must have lived in a state of constant, crippling anxiety. But did they, or was this ever-present risk so normal that it was simply woven into the fabric of their worldview? Some argue for a kind of stoic fatalism, a belief that one's time was ultimately in God's hands, and that worrying was both useless and impious. Others suggest that the fear was very real, but it was expressed differently through obsessive prayer, superstitious rituals, and a desperate search for any cure, no matter how strange, that promised to tip the scales in their favor. The truth is likely somewhere in between, a complex mix of faith, fear, and pragmatism. But you don't have the luxury of academic debate. You have a splinter wound. You press your thumb over the spot, as if you could physically stop the inevitable invasion. The blood has stopped, but your imagination is running wild. You can almost feel the phantom throbbing begin. The dread is no longer a vague notion, it's a certainty. You need help. You need a doctor, or at least, whatever passes for one in this time and place. And that thought is almost as frightening as the wound itself. You show the tiny, angry-looking puncture in your palm to the woman of the house, your face a mask of modern, germ-aware panic. She looks at it, then at you, and seems to understand your distress, even if she doesn't understand its intensity. After a moment of thought, she wipes her hands on her apron and says, "We'll see the barber." The barber. The word conjures images of striped poles, shaving cream, and the pleasant snip-snip of scissors. A friendly chat while you get a neat trim. But you're about to learn that the red on that striped pole wasn't originally there to represent anything so benign as a brand color. It symbolized blood. She leads you out the front door and into the bustling street. Your earlier view from the window was just a snapshot. Now you're immersed in the full sensory overload of a 17th century city. The air is a thick soup of smells: horse manure, sweat, baking bread, tanning leather, and the ever-present coal smoke that stings the back of your throat. The noise is a chaotic symphony, the iron-rimmed wheels of a cart clattering over cobblestones, a blacksmith's hammer ringing out a steady rhythm, street vendors shouting their wares, and the general hum of 100 conversations happening at once. You navigate the narrow, crowded street, dodging a pig that's strutting purposefully down the middle of the lane and sidestepping a puddle of something you'd rather not identify. After a few turns, you arrive. It's a small, unassuming shop, distinguished only by the iconic pole hanging by the door, a wooden staff painted with red and white spiraling stripes. In the window, you can see a few jars filled with cloudy liquids and, unsettlingly, a neat row of extracted tea, displayed like tiny, morbid trophies. This is the domain of the barber-surgeon. For centuries, the two professions were inextricably linked. Your barber was the man you went to for a haircut and a shave. Yes, but he was also your dentist, your surgeon, and your general first aid provider. The logic, in a way, made sense. Who else had such sharp razors and such a steady hand? The formal physicians. The university-educated doctors considered surgery to be a messy, manual craft. Far beneath their intellectual dignity, they would diagnose and prescribe. But the actual cutting, the hands-on work, was left to the tradesmen, the barbers. You step inside. The shop is a single, cramped room. One side has the familiar chair and mirrors for hairstyling. The other side, however, looks very different. There's a sturdy wooden table, heavily stained, with leather straps attached to its legs. On a shelf above it is a terrifying array of polished metal tools, saws of various sizes, forceps, sharp-looking hooks, and a collection of wicked-looking knives. The air inside smells of medicinal herbs, soap, and faintly, coppery and sharp, of old blood. The barber-surgeon himself is a stout man with a thick leather apron and surprisingly delicate hands. He is in the middle of shaving a customer, holding a straight razor with practiced ease. He sees you and the woman enter, notes the concern on your faces, and with a final, smooth scrape, he finishes his task, wipes the razor on a cloth, and turns his attention to you. "Trouble?" he asks, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. You hold out your hand. He takes it, his thumb surprisingly gentle, and examines the small wound. He hums to himself, peering at it closely. "A nasty little splinter. We'll have that sorted." His version of sorting it is what you were afraid of. He gestures you towards the less inviting side of his shop. But before we get to his proposed treatment, let's talk about a strange and specific part of his job, the bezoar stone. This was one of the most prized medical commodities of the era. A bezoar is a hard mouse, a sort of stone, found in the digestive tract of certain animals, most famously a type of Persian goat. It was believed to be a universal antidote to poison. If you were wealthy enough, you would own one and either shave a little bit of it into your drink as a preventative measure or have it on hand in case you were poisoned. The barber-surgeon, as a frontline health worker, would sometimes have a small, precious bezoar stone to administer in dire cases. It was wildly expensive, its efficacy entirely based on folklore. But it was a perfect example of how medicine was a blend of the practical and the magical. Back in the shop, the barber-surgeon isn't reaching for a magical stone. He is reaching for something far more mundane and far more worrying. He picks up a small, pointed metal tool from his tray. His intention is clear. He wants to open up the wound, dig around in there, and make sure every last remnant of the wood is gone. To you, this sounds like a terrible idea, introducing more bacteria, causing more trauma. To him, it's just good practice. Get the foreign body out. And here we touch upon another one of those historical debates. For a long time, historians portrayed these barber surgeons as ignorant butchers. But more recent scholarship has tried to offer a more nuanced view. They were skilled craftsmen operating within the limits of their knowledge. They could set broken bones, stitch wounds, and perform amputations with a speed that was essential in an age without anesthesia. They were often more practical and effective than the university-trained physicians, who were still slavishly following ancient Greek texts that were over 1,000 years old. The barber-surgeon was an essential, respected, and deeply feared part of the community. They were doing their best with what they had. The problem, of course, was that what they had was fundamentally wrong. They didn't know about germs. They thought the real enemy was the splinter itself, not the invisible world it carried with it. And so, the proposed cure was often just another form of injury. You look at the metal probe in his hand, then at the tiny red hole in yours, and a wave of nausea washes over you. There has to be another way. There has to be a better option than this. And it's in this moment of quiet desperation that you're about to hear the first whispers of a revolutionary and utterly insane new idea. The barber-surgeon sees the hesitation on your face, the sheer terror in your eyes as you stare at the metal probe. He misinterprets it, perhaps, as fear of the pain. "It'll be quick," he says, trying to be reassuring. "A moment's sting is better than a week of fever." He's not wrong about the fever, but his proposed solution feels instinctively, fundamentally wrong. Before he can proceed, the woman who brought you here speaks up. "Is there nothing else?" she asks, her voice quiet. "The wound is so small. To cut it seemed a pity." The barber-surgeon shrugs, placing the probe back on his tray with a metallic click. We can try the old ways. Then, he says, his tone suggesting this is a lesser, though still acceptable, option. He turns and opens a small wooden cabinet, and the smell of dried herbs and pungent oils intensifies. You are about to be introduced to the standard, mainstream medical theory of the day, humoral theory. This idea, inherited from the ancient Greeks, specifically Hippocrates and Galen, was the unshakable foundation of Western medicine for over 500 years. It stated that the human body was composed of four essential fluids, or humus: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these four humours in perfect balance. Sickness, whether a common cold or a raging infection, was simply the result of one or more of these humours being out of whack. Therefore, the entire goal of medicine was to restore this balance. Got a fever, you probably have an excess of blood, which was considered hot and moist. The solution: get rid of some. This is where the practice of bloodletting came from. The barber-surgeon would take a special knife called a lancet, make a small incision in a vein, usually in the arm, and drain a prescribed amount of blood into a bowl. The amount drained was often alarmingly large. For a different ailment, the doctor might try to induce vomiting to get rid of excess yellow bile, or prescribe a laxative to purge black bile. It was all about rebalancing the system. So when the barber-surgeon looks at your red, slightly inflamed hand, he doesn't see a bacterial infection. He sees a localized excess of blood, the hot humor, rushing to the site of the injury and causing an imbalance. His first suggestion, cutting it open, served a dual purpose in his mind: remove the foreign object and let some of the bad excess blood out. But since you've rejected that, he moves to the next logical step in his world cauterization. He reaches for a long iron poker resting by the small coal brazier he uses to heat his water. The tip is flat and disc-shaped. His plan is to heat this poker until it glows red hot and then press it firmly onto your little wound. The searing pain would be immense, but the logic was sound. According to their beliefs, the intense heat would burn away the corrupted flesh and humors, seal the wound to prevent further bad air from getting in, and stop the bleeding. It was brutal, terrifying, and a very common way to treat all sorts of wounds, from minor cuts to major amputations. You can imagine the smell of burning flesh, the scream of the patient, and the stoic belief of the surgeon that he was saving a life. And here's a little known fact about these procedures: they had a rudimentary form of pain management, but it was incredibly dangerous. They would use things like mandrake root, opium, or henbane, often soaked in a sponge that the patient would inhale from. The problem was dosage. There was no standardization. The line between rendering a patient unconscious and accidentally killing them was terrifyingly thin, which is why most surgeons and patients simply relied on speed, strong assistants to hold the person down, and a leather strap to bite on. The barber-surgeon is now holding the coal poker, gesturing with it to explain what he's about to do. He's not being cruel, he's being professional. He's offering you the gold standard of care for the 17th century. He is proposing to burn your hand with a red-hot piece of iron to save you from the almost certain infection that he believes is caused by an imbalance of internal fluids. You recoil, pulling your hand back as if you've already been burned. The very idea is monstrous. The pain would be 1,000 times worse than the splinter itself. You look from the poker to the lancet to the cutting tools. All of his solutions involve more pain, more injury. This is the moment of absolute despair. It's the feeling of being trapped between a rock and a hard place. Let the wound fester and risk death by infection, or submit to a cure that is, in itself, a form of torture. It feels like a dead end. Every accepted medical practice of the time seems designed to make things worse. Your 21st century knowledge screams that leaving it alone is the best option. But you don't have the language or the authority to explain germ theory to this man. To him, leaving it alone would be malpractice, a dereliction of his duty. Historians often wonder why people accepted such brutal treatments. The answer is complex. Partly, it was the lack of alternatives. Partly, it was the immense authority of ancient texts and traditions. And partly, it was the very real fear of the alternative. They had all seen people die from minor injuries. So the idea of a short, sharp shock to prevent that outcome made a certain kind of desperate sense. The debate isn't whether their methods were wrong, they obviously were, but rather why they held on to these wrong ideas for so long with such conviction. You shake your head, unable to speak, and back away towards the door. The barber-surgeon looks offended. The woman who brought you looks worried and confused. You can't do this. You won't. There has to be something else. Anything else. And it's in that moment of absolute refusal, standing in the doorway of this chamber of horrors, that you will finally hear the name that offers a third path. A path that sounds gentle, magical, and almost too good to be true. As you stand frozen in the doorway, caught between the well-meaning butcher inside and the indifferent, infection-filled world outside, the woman beside you seems to have an epiphany. A flicker of something memory, or maybe gossip she heard at the market crosses her face. Wait, she says, her voice slow and conspiratorial, pulling you by the elbow out of the shop and a few steps down the street, out of the barber-surgeon's earshot. There is another way, a new way. They talk about it at court. The words new way and court immediately catch your attention. They suggest something sophisticated, modern, and perhaps less reliant on hot iron. You lean in, desperate. They talk of a man, she continues, her eyes wide, a gentleman, Sir Kenelm Digby. They say he has a powder of sympathy. She says the name as if it's a secret password. Powder of Sympathy. It sounds alchemical, mystical, like something from a fairy tale. It doesn't sound like medicine at all. And right now, that's exactly what you want. A powder, you prompt. What does it do? They say, she whispers. And you can tell she's repeating a story that has likely grown with each telling. That it can heal a wound from a distance. You don't put it on the person. You don't even have to see the person. You put it on the weapon that made the cut. You stare at her. That can't be right. You must have misheard. Heal the weapon is the most absurd thing you've ever heard. Your modern brain, steeped in biology and chemistry, immediately rejects it as nonsense. It sounds like a child's magical thinking. A joke. A scam. But you are not in your world anymore. You are here. And you have to try to understand the idea through their eyes. In a world without a unifying theory of physics, where the lines between chemistry and alchemy, astronomy and astrology, were hopelessly blurred, the idea of action at a distance wasn't entirely crazy. They saw it all the time. The moon, miles away, pulled the tides. A lodestone, without touching it, could make a compass needle move. The sun warmed your face from millions of miles away. Why couldn't there be other, more subtle, invisible forces connecting things? This is the intellectual landscape you've landed in. It's a world where the universe is not a machine of cold, impersonal laws, but a web of hidden connections and sympathies. The core belief was that things that were once connected, or that bore a resemblance to each other, maintained a mystical link. This was the basis for a huge amount of folk magic. To curse an enemy, you would make a doll in their image resemblance. To heal a wound, you would treat the blade that was once physically connected to it contact. This wasn't seen as silly superstition by everyone too many. It was natural philosophy, an exploration of God's subtle and mysterious laws. The woman can see the disbelief on your face. I know how it sounds, she says, defensively. But the king himself is interested in Master James Howell. You know, the writer he swears by. He had a terrible wound, and Sir Digby cured him without even touching him. It is the talk of London. Her story is a perfect example of how new ideas, especially strange ones, spread, not through scientific journals or peer-reviewed studies, but through gossip, testimonials, and, crucially, the endorsement of high-status individuals. If a famous writer or a nobleman believes it, there must be something to it. It's a powerful form of social proof that can easily override common sense. Here we encounter a curious and sad little tidbit of medical history, the sheer number of completely useless but popular remedies that have existed for centuries. Mummy powder literally. Ground up ancient Egyptian mummies was a common ingredient in medicinal compounds, believed to transfer the ancients' longevity to the patient. Another popular cure for all sorts of ailments was unicorn horn, which was, of course, usually the tusk of a narwhal, sold at an astronomical price. These weren't fringe ideas, they were mainstream medicine, found in the official pharmacopoeias. In that context, a powder that worked through sympathy wasn't even the strangest thing on the pharmacy shelf. The most debated aspect among historians of this pre-scientific era is how to label these beliefs. Were they magical or scientific? The truth is, people at the time wouldn't have made that distinction. To a man like Sir Kenelm Digby, his powder of sympathy wasn't magic in the demonic, supernatural sense. He would have argued it was a natural process, governed by physical laws that we were only just beginning to understand. He would have called it science. We, with the benefit of hindsight, call it pseudoscience or magic. But this distinction is our own modern invention, a line drawn in the sand that simply didn't exist in the 17th century. So there you stand, in a muddy London street, with a throbbing hand and an impossible choice. Behind you is the barber-surgeon with his hot iron and his brutal, but understandable, logic. In front of you is the whisper of a new cure, a cure that sounds like pure fantasy, a laughable piece of magical thinking, but it offers one thing that the barber cannot: a promise of no pain, the choice to treat the weapon, not the wound. It's an insane proposition, but your other option is to be tortured. Desperation is a powerful motivator. It can make the most ridiculous ideas seem plausible. Does Sir Digby, you ask, the name feeling strange on your tongue? Where can we find him? The woman smiles, a flicker of excitement in her eyes. She has convinced you. She has seen the glimmer of hope replace the look of terror on your face. You are about to seek out the most charismatic, intelligent, and controversial celebrity scientist of the age, hoping he will sprinkle some magic dust on a piece of wood from a bucket handle to cure your hand. The absurdity is overwhelming, but so is the relief. You're on your way. Following the woman's directions, you make your way through the winding, chaotic streets of London toward the district favored by the gentry. As you walk, the character of the city begins to change. The narrow, leaning timber houses give way to grander structures of brick and stone. The streets are slightly wider, and instead of pigs and chickens, you see handsome carriages pulled by well-groomed horses. The people, too, are different. The rough woolen plain linen of the common folk are replaced by the silks, velvets, and elaborate lace collars of the wealthy. You're entering a different world, one of influence, learning, and power. You are looking for the home of Sir Kenelm Digby, and even just asking for him tells you something. People know the name. They point you in the right direction with a mixture of awe and curiosity. He is clearly a public figure, a celebrity. And what a figure he was. Before you even meet him, you need to understand who you're dealing with. Sir Kenelm Digby was not some back-alley mystic or traveling charlatan. He was one of the most remarkable and, frankly, baffling figures of the 17th century. To call him a Renaissance man would be an understatement. He was more like a one-man intellectual whirlwind. Born in 1603 to a notorious family, his father, Sir Everard Digby, was executed for his part in the gunpowder plot to blow up Parliament. Kenelm was blessed with a brilliant mind, a towering physique. He was reportedly 6'4", and an almost pathological level of self-confidence. He was a courtier, a diplomat for King Charles I, a swashbuckling privateer who won a major naval battle in the Mediterranean, a philosopher who corresponded with René Descartes, and a founding member of the Royal Society, one of the most important scientific institutions in history. He was also an alchemist, a devout Catholic in a predominantly Protestant country, and a man whose personal life was as dramatic as his public one, including a legendary romance with his wife, the famous beauty Venetia Stanley. He was, in short, a superstar. He embodied the contradictions of his age. He was a pioneering scientist who championed observation and experiment, yet he was also deeply immersed in the world of Hermetic philosophy, astrology, and alchemy. He was trying to find a rational, mechanical explanation for everything in the universe, including things we would now consider magic. You finally arrive at his residence, a large and imposing house. A servant, looking slightly askance at your common attire but too well trained to be rude, leads you through an entryway and into a study. And what a study it is! The room is a testament to its owner's eclectic and insatiable curiosity. Bookshelves groan under the weight of leather-bound volumes in a half-dozen languages. On a large table, astronomical charts and maps are spread out next to strange-looking glass beakers and retorts, the tools of an alchemist's laboratory. In one corner, a human skeleton hangs from a stand, and on the walls are paintings, exotic artifacts, and perhaps even the mounted head of some strange beast. This is not the office of a doctor, it is the sanctuary of a polymath. Then, he enters. Sir Kenelm Digby is every bit as impressive as his reputation suggests. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moves with the easy grace of an aristocrat and confidence of a man who is certain of his own genius. He is dressed impeccably in dark, expensive fabrics, but there's a certain intellectual untidness about him, an ink smudge on his cuff, a stray hair falling across his forehead. He regards you with intensely intelligent, dark eyes. "You have come about a wound," he says. "It's not a question." He has likely had a steady stream of such visitors. His voice is deep and sonorous, the voice of a man used to commanding attention in royal courts and lecture halls. You nervously hold out your hand, showing him the small, red, and now distinctly throbbing puncture wound, but he barely glances at it. This is the first strange sign. A normal doctor would examine the injury. Digby's interest lies elsewhere, and the agent of this unfortunate prick, he asks, "The weapon, the tool, the object that bears the guilt, the woman who guided you, who has been standing silently in the background." Nervously produces the cause of all this trouble, the splinter. She has wrapped it carefully in a small piece of cloth. It looks absurdly small and insignificant in this grand room. Digby takes the splinter. He holds it, not with disgust, but with the intense focus of a scientist observing a specimen. He turns it over and over in his long fingers. To him, this piece of wood is now the patient. Your hand is merely a symptom. This brings us to a strange, culinary side note about Sir Kenelm. Among his many, many writings, he left behind a cookbook called The Closet of the Eminently Learned Sir Kenelm Digby, IEKT. Open. It's a fascinating collection of recipes for things like mead, marmalade, and pan pudding. But scattered among them are also his medical and cosmetic preparations, with no clear distinction. He might offer a recipe for stewed snails on one page and a beautifying face cream on the next. It perfectly illustrates his worldview. Cookery, chemistry, medicine, and magic were all just different branches of the same tree of knowledge, all aimed at manipulating the natural world. The debate among historians about Digby is fierce and fascinating. Was he a genuine scientist held back by the limitations of his time, a brilliant man fumbling on the very edge of discovery, or was he a masterful self-promoter, a charismatic charlatan who used his intellect and social standing to sell a magical cure he knew was nonsense? Some scholars point to his work with gases. He was one of the first to understand the necessity of oxygen for plants as proof of his scientific credentials. Others point to his wild, unsubstantiated claims about the powder of sympathy and his alchemical pursuits as evidence that he was more showman than scientist. The truth is, he was probably both. He was a transitional figure, a man with one foot in the old world of magic and one foot in the new world of science, and he saw no contradiction between them. He looks up from the splinter, a confident, reassuring smile on his face. "Fear not," he says, his voice booming with certainty. The remedy is at hand. The cure will be swift. You are in the presence of greatness, or perhaps in the presence of one of history's greatest salesmen. It's impossible to tell, but as he turns towards a small, ornate chest on his desk, you feel a surge of hope. You are about to witness the famous Powder of Sympathy in action for the very first time. Sir Kenelm Digby sets the small, guilty-looking splinter down on a clean piece of parchment on his cluttered desk. He then turns to the ornate chest you noticed earlier. It's made of a dark, polished wood, inlaid with mother of pearl. He produces a small, elegant key from his waistcoat pocket and unlocks it. The sense of theater is palpable. This isn't just a medical procedure, it's a performance. Inside the chest, nestled on a bed of velvet, is a simple glass vial containing a small amount of a greenish blue, crystalline powder. It glitters under the light from the window, looking like crushed gemstones. This is it, the legendary Powder of Sympathy. As he prepares, you can't help but think of the story that made this powder famous. The story the woman in the street alluded to. It was the case of James Howell, a well-known writer and contemporary of Digby's. The story, as Digby himself told it in a famous lecture, is the foundational myth of this entire buzz art therapy. According to Digby, James Howell had been trying to intervene in a sword fight between two of his friends. In the process of trying to break them up, his hand was horribly wounded, slashed to the bone by a rapier. In the days that followed, the wound did exactly what you fear yours will do. It became severely infected. The doctors, using the standard treatments of the time like painful bombs and probes, were failing miserably. The infection worsened. The pain became unbearable, and amputation was being seriously considered as a last resort to save Howell's life. In desperation, Howell remembered hearing of his friend Digby's miraculous powder. He sent a servant to fetch Digby, who arrived to find Howell in a terrible state. Now, here is the crucial part of the story. Digby didn't ask to see Howell's hand. Instead, he asked for the one thing nobody else had thought to care about: the blood-stained garter that Howell had used as a makeshift bandage at the scene. The servant produced the garter, stiff with dried blood. Digby, with the flair of a magician, took a basin of water and simply dissolved a small amount of his powder into it. Then, he dropped the bloody garter into the basin and left it there to soak. He did absolutely nothing to Howell himself, who was in another room, except to tell him to remove all the old bandages and dressings from his hand and simply rest. And then, the miracle happened. According to Digby's account, Howell, who had been writhing in pain just moments before, suddenly cried out that his hand felt cool and comfortable. The terrible, burning pain had vanished almost instantly. The two men had lunched, and over the next few hours, the swelling in Howell's hand went down. When the doctors arrived later that day, they were stunned to find the wound looking clean and beginning to heal. They declared it a miracle. To add a dramatic flourish to his story, Digby claimed that he later decided to conduct a little experiment. Without telling Howell, he took the garter out of the powdered water and set it in the sun to dry. Almost immediately, back in his home, Howell's hand began to throb and burn with pain again. The infection seemed to be returning. Digby, hearing of this, simply put the garter back into the basin of cool, medicated water, and just as quickly, Howell's pain subsided once more, and the healing process resumed. This story is everything. It's the perfect clinical trial, case study, and marketing pitch all rolled into one. It has a desperate patient, failed mainstream treatments, a dramatic intervention, an instant result, and even a control experiment to prove the connection. It's an anecdote so powerful it can override 1,000 objections. Of course, historians have looked at this story with a great deal of skepticism. Did it really happen this way? Digby was a known self-promoter, and Howell, his friend, may have been inclined to support his fantastic claims. The debate isn't whether Howell's hand got better, it likely did, but whether the cause and effect were as Digby described. It's entirely possible that Howell's hand once freed from the poking and prodding of his other doctors and simply cleaned and left to its own devices, began to heal naturally. The relapse when the garter was dried could have been a coincidence, or a psychosomatic response from a man who deeply believed in the cure, or perhaps a detail exaggerated by Digby for dramatic effect. We will never know for sure. The academic world still gently argues over whether Digby was deliberately deceiving people, or if he was so caught up in his own theory that he genuinely interpreted events this way. But in this room, right now, that story is gospel. It is the proof that this impossible thing works. Digby is now reenacting that legendary cure. But on a miniature scale, he takes a small silver bowl, pours in a little water from a carafe on his desk, and then, with a tiny spoon, he sprinkles a pinch of the glittering green-blue powder into the water. It fizzes slightly, dissolving into a clear solution. He picks up the splinter your weapon with a pair of tweezers. He looks at you, his eyes shining with an almost fanatical belief in what he's about to do. "No," he says, his voice low and dramatic. The sympathy begins. He drops the splinter into the bowl. It sinks to the bottom, and a few tiny air bubbles rise to the surface. And that's it. The treatment is done. Your hand is miles away, metaphorically speaking. It hasn't been touched. No pain. No poking. No burning. Just a piece of wood soaking in a bowl on a fancy desk. You watch, half expecting to feel a sudden, miraculous coolness spread through your palm. You stand there, staring at the splinter resting at the bottom of the silver bowl, and then you look at your hand. You feel nothing. No sudden coolness. No magical relief. The dull, anxious throbbing is still there. A persistent reminder of the tiny invasion. A seed of doubt begins to sprout. Was that it? Sir Kenelm Digby, however, looks immensely pleased with himself. As if H.E.S. just performed a complex and delicate operation. He sees the questioning look on your face and chuckles. A deep, knowing sound. "Patience," he says. "The atoms are at work. The cure has begun its journey." Atoms, the word sounds strangely modern. But you're about to learn that his science is a unique and bizarre fusion of ancient mysticism and what was then cutting-edge theory. To understand the powder, you have to understand its recipe. What exactly is this glittering substance that he guards so carefully in his ornate chest? Digby himself was rather coy about the exact recipe, sometimes hinting it was a secret revealed to him by a Carmelite monk in Florence, who had learned it in the exotic East. This added to the mystique and made it harder for rivals to copy. However, through his writings and the analyses of his contemporaries, we have a very good idea of what was in it. The primary ingredient, the star of the show, was something called vitriol. Specifically, it was copper sulfate, or sometimes iron sulfate. These are naturally occurring mineral salts, often called blue vitriol or green vitriol, respectively, which explains the powder's greenish-blue color. You might know copper sulfate today as a common fungicide for gardens or an agent used to control algae in pools. In the 17th century, it was a staple of alchemical experiments. The process of making the powder involved taking these crystals of vitriol, letting them dissolve in the open air, often in the sun. Digby believed that during this process, the vitriol crystals absorbed the selenium spiritual particles from the sun's rays, charging them with a special kind of energy. This solar-charged vitriol was the core of the remedy. But often, it wasn't just plain vitriol. The recipe frequently called for a much grimmer, more disturbing ingredient: powdered earthworms. The worms were to be washed, dried in an oven until they could be crumbled into a powder, and then mixed with the vitriol. The logic here was based on the doctrine of signatures, a belief that God had marked plants and animals with a sign, or signature, indicating their purpose. Since worms live in the earth and regenerate when cut in half, they were seen as powerful symbols of healing and regeneration from the earth. Grinding them up was thought to release this regenerative essence. And if you wanted the deluxe, premium version of the powder, there was an even more shocking ingredient. Sometimes, the recipe called for pulvis sympatheticus ex cranio humano, the sympathetic powder from a human skull. The skull had to be from a man who had died a violent death, but had not been buried, for instance. A hanged criminal left on the gallows. The idea was that the vital spirit was trapped in the bones of someone who died suddenly. This skull would be shattered, and the pieces would be ground into a fine dust and mixed with the other ingredients. This is a perfect example of how the lines between medicine, alchemy, and outright graveyard ghoulishness were non-existent. It's a gruesome thought. But here's a weirdly specific bit of historical trivia connected to this. The most prized skulls were said to be those with a bit of moss growing on them, called usni. This skull moss was considered an incredibly potent medical ingredient in its own right, and its presence on a skull was thought to enhance the sympathetic power of the powder made from it. Pharmacists and apothecaries would pay a premium for it. So this miracle cure, this sophisticated remedy of the London elite, is essentially a mixture of industrial minerals, powdered worms, and sometimes the ground-up skull of an executed convict. It's a chilling reminder of how different their understanding of the body and the world was. The historical debate here isn't about the ingredients themselves, we're fairly certain of those. The debate is about Digby's belief. Did he truly believe in the vital spirit of a hanged man, or was he just a master of branding? Some historians argue that Digby, with his knowledge of chemistry, was primarily interested in the vitriol. He may have seen it react in certain chemical processes and attributed properties to it that it didn't have. The more esoteric ingredients, like the skull dust and worms, might have been a concession to popular magical beliefs. A way to make his cures seem more powerful and mysterious to a public that expected a bit of horror in their remedies. Others argue that he believed it all, that in his mind, the chemical properties of vitriol and the spiritual essence of a skull were a part of the same natural philosophy, equally valid and equally scientific. Digby now carefully dries the silver bowl and the tweezers, his movements precise and deliberate. He explains to you that the powder, once prepared, is a powerful magnet for spirit. Specifically, he believes it has a natural affinity for the spirit contained in blood. The powder, he would argue, doesn't heal the weapon, it draws the essence of the wound out of your body and into the weapon, where it can be dealt with more easily. You look from the vile concoction he's just described in your mind, at least to your still aching hand. You've traded the barber's hot iron for a mad scientist's alchemical potion made of mossy bones and worms. Suddenly, the simple, brutal honesty of the barber-surgeon seems almost appealing in comparison, at least his method, however barbaric, was straightforward. This is something else entirely. It's a journey into the deepest, strangest corridors of the 17th century mind. Sir Kenelm Digby, seeing your continued skepticism, decides it's time for the lecture portion of your treatment. He can't just perform the magic, he has to explain the science behind it. For him, this wasn't faith healing, it was applied physics, and he was eager to prove it. You doubt, he says, leaning back in his large chair. It is the mark of an intelligent mind. But allow me to illuminate the principles at work. This is not sorcery. It is a function of nature's grand design, governed by corpuscles and a universal ether. And with that, you're plunged into one of the most wonderfully convoluted and brilliantly wrong scientific theories you've ever heard. Digby begins by explaining the world, not as a place of gods and spirits, but as a place of tiny, invisible particles. He was a proponent of corpuscular ionism, a forerunner to modern atomic theory. The idea was that everything your body, the splinter, the air, the light was made of infinitesimally small particles, or corpuscles. This part, at least, sounds surprisingly modern and on the right track. But here's where it takes a sharp turn into delightful absurdity. According to Digby and many thinkers of his time, these corpuscles were constantly streaming off of every object in the universe. Imagine everything around you, the desk, the books. Your own body is constantly shedding a fine, invisible dust of itself into the air. This dust carries the essence or the signature of the object it came from. So when the splinter pierced your hand, a transaction occurred. Corpuscles from your blood, carrying its heat and its spirit, latched onto the corpuscles of the splinter. A link was formed. The two objects were now intimately connected by this exchange of tiny particles. Now for the second key ingredient of his theory, the ether. For Digby, the space between objects wasn't empty. The entire universe was filled with a subtle, invisible medium called the ether or ether. It was the substance that filled all voids and through which everything light, heat, and his mysterious sympathetic forces traveled. Think of it like the air carrying sound, or water carrying ripples. So here's the grand theory in action when he puts the powder of sympathy on the splinter. A reaction begins. The powder, which he believes is highly attractive to the spirit of blood, starts to draw the blood corpuscles that are on the splinter towards itself. But it doesn't stop there, because the splinter and your wound are now in sympathy. This attraction creates a kind of vacuum effect that travels through the universal ether. He would explain it like this: imagine your wound is full of hot, inflamed, unhappy blood particles that are causing pain and swelling. The powder of sympathy, sitting in a bowl across town, is gently and persistently pulling on these particles. It's like a magical, invisible siphon. The powder draws the tainted spirits and overheated atoms from your wound, across the city, through the ether, and harmlessly deposits them in the bowl of water. As these bad particles leave your wound, your body is able to heat itself more naturally. The pain subsides because the agitated atoms that cause it are being removed. The inflammation goes down because the excess heat is being drawn away. The cure happens on your hand, but the engine of the cure is sitting on his desk. It's a beautifully elegant, completely bonkers explanation. It uses all the trendy scientific buzzwords of the day: atoms, ether, attraction, motion, to justify what is essentially a magical spell. And here's a quirky little side detail that shows how deeply this particle thinking went. Some people extended this logic to other senses. The philosopher Pierre Gassendi, a contemporary of Digby, argued that when we see an object, it's because a film or skin of atoms is peeling off that object and flying into our eyeballs. So vision wasn't just about light reflecting, it was about catching a physical piece of the thing you were looking at. This is how intertwined the physical and the sensory were in their worldview. The ongoing historical argument here revolves around the source of Digby's ideas. Was he a true original? Or was he just repackaging much older concepts? The idea of sympathetic magic is ancient, found in cultures all over the world. The concept of atoms comes from the ancient Greeks, like Democritus. The concept of a universal medium like the ether was also a classical idea. What historians debate is whether Digby's contribution was a stroke of genius synthesizing these old ideas into a new, modern mechanical framework, or if he was simply dressing up old superstition in the fashionable new language of science to make it palatable to an increasingly rationalistic age. Was he a revolutionary thinker or just a very good marketing executive? He finishes his explanation with a flourish, gesturing from the bowl to you, as if to say, He genuinely believes he has given you a rational, mechanical, and scientific explanation for his cure. He doesn't see it as magic. He sees it as the logical application of the laws of nature, laws that he is privileged to understand. You, on the other hand, are left trying to process this. Your 21st century brain is trying to find a flaw in the logic. But the system is so internally consistent and based on such fundamentally flawed premises that it's almost impossible to argue with. You can't say the other doesn't exist, because to him, its existence is self-evident. You can't say atoms don't stream off of objects, because that's the foundation of his entire physics. You're trapped in his paradigm. All you can do is nod along, pretending to understand this symphony of nonsense, while the little hole in your hand continues its silent, rhythmic protest. Having laid out his grand scientific theory, Sir Kenelm Digby now zooms in on the core concept, the engine that makes the whole thing run, the principle of sympathy itself. He wants you to understand that this isn't just a one-off trick for wounds, it's a fundamental law of the universe. Sympathy and antipathy, he proclaims, steepling his long fingers, are the two great hinges upon which the world turns. They are the invisible threads that weave the tapestry of creation. All things are connected. You say, the secret is knowing where the connections lie. He is now moving beyond his pseudo-physics of atoms and ether and into the much older, more mystical realm of Hermetic philosophy and what was often called natural magic. This was a worldview, popular since the Renaissance, that saw the universe not as a collection of dead matter, but as a single, living organism. The stars, the planets, minerals, plants, animals, and humans were all interconnected parts of one divine body. Just as a wound in your foot can give you a fever in your head, an event in one part of the cosmos could affect another, seemingly unrelated part. The key to this system was sympathy, a hidden affinity between things. The most famous example, which he would have certainly known, was the relationship between the moon and the tides. To a 17th century thinker, this was a perfect demonstration of cosmic sympathy. The moon, though distant, had a mysterious affinity with the ocean, causing it to ebb and flow. There was no visible connection, no ray pulling the water, yet the influence was undeniable. If the moon could do that to the entire ocean, why couldn't a specially prepared powder have a similar, if smaller, effect on the blood in a wound? He might have offered other examples. A sunflower, it was believed, follows the sun across the sky not because of any biological process like phototropism, but because it feels a natural sympathy for the sun, its celestial parent. Certain herbs were believed to grow near the minerals they could be used to transmute in alchemy. Everything was linked. This brings us to one of the more charmingly bizarre applications of this belief, the sympathetic telegraph. This was a theoretical invention, a kind of magical telephone, that several thinkers, including the alchemist Jan Baptist van Helmont, a major influence on Digby, proposed. The idea was this: you would take a single needle and magnetize it. Then you would cut it in half, giving one half to a friend. You would both mount your needle hands on a dial marked with the letters of the alphabet. Because the two halves were once one, they would retain a permanent sympathetic link. When you turned your needle to point to the letter H, your friend's needle, miles away, would supposedly turn to point to H at the exact same moment. You could, in theory, spell out messages from a distance. It was a beautiful, magical idea, a 17th century fantasy of instant messaging based entirely on this principle of sympathy. Of course, it never worked. But the fact that serious intellectuals spent time thinking about it shows how deeply embedded this worldview was. Digby's Powder of Sympathy was just an application of this universal law to the field of medicine. The blood on the weapon or the garter, or your splinter, retained a sympathetic link to the blood still in your body. They were part of the same organism, just temporarily separated. By treating the blood on the weapon, you were rating the whole system. The opposing force, he would explain, was antipathy. Just as some things were drawn together, others were naturally repellent. It was believed, for instance, that a wolf and a sheep had a natural antipathy, so strong that the string of a lute made from a wolf's gut would snap if it heard the bleating of a sheep, or that a diamond, the hardest stone, could be shattered by the application of goat's blood. Its natural antagonist. These ideas seem like pure folklore to us, but to natural philosophers of the time, they were clues, data points in an attempt to map the universe's hidden operating system. The historical debate here is a subtle one. We know these ideas were ancient, but how were they viewed by the new scientists of the 17th century? Were men like Digby the last gasp of a dying magical worldview? Or were they trying to rationalize it and incorporate it into the new mechanical philosophy? Some historians argue that the rise of the scientific method, with its emphasis on repeatable, observable evidence, was a direct rejection of this kind of thinking. They see a clear break, a scientific revolution, where sympathy was thrown out and replaced by gravity. Other historians argue the transition was much messier and more gradual. They point out that even Sir Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics, was deeply interested in alchemy and spent years trying to understand the active principles that cause things like gravity to work, a concept not entirely dissimilar from sympathy. For a time, the old magic and the new science coexisted, sometimes even in the mind of the same person. So when Digby speaks of sympathy, he's not just talking about his powder, he's explaining his entire cosmology. He believes the universe is a web of secret messages, and he is one of the few who can read them. He has moved far beyond your specific little world and is now painting a grand, romantic, and utterly captivating picture of a living, breathing, interconnected cosmos. He leans forward, his lecture reaching its climax. So you see, he says, his voice filled with the passion of a true believer, to treat the weapon is not a foolish superstition. It is the most logical course of action, for the weapon is not just a piece of wood. It is an ambassador from your wound, and by treating the ambassador, we send a message of healing directly to the king. In his analogy, the king is your body. The logic is poetic, majestic, and completely divorced from biological reality. But in this room, in this moment, it feels almost convincing. The theory is elegant. Is it not, Sir Kenelm Digby says, satisfied with his cosmic explanation? But theory without practice is mere philosophy. Let us proceed with the practical application. You thought the treatment was already done, splinter in the bowl. End of story. But you're about to learn that there's a specific, ritual-like procedure for treating the weapon, and every step is important. This isn't just a matter of passively soaking, it's an active process. Digby rises from his chair and walks over to the window, carrying the silver bowl with the water, the powder, and your little splinter. The medium of the cure is twofold. He explains, the powder, and the air itself. The air, you say, is the great messenger, carrying the sympathetic virtues from the weapon to the wound. He finds a spot on the wide windowsill where the pale London sunlight is strongest. The sun's rays, as I've mentioned, are themselves filled with spirit and energy. They activate the vitriol and speed the healing message on its way. So step 1 of the treatment is to place the weapon, immersed in the powder solution, in a bright, airy place. A dark, damp cellar would not do. The environment of the treatment matters. Next, he turns his attention back to the weapon itself. In your case, it's a simple splinter, but in the more common cases of sword or dagger wounds, the weapon would need to be carefully tended to. Digby lays out the rules as if reciting from a sacred text. The weapon must be kept clean, he states firmly. If it is a blade, it must be polished daily. Any new rust or tarnish that appears is a sign of the malignity being drawn from the wound. This corruption must be wiped away, lest it return to the patient. So you have this incredible image, a concerned family member, instead of tending to their wounded loved one, is sitting by the window diligently polishing a bloody sword, carefully wiping away any specks of rust, believing that this action is directly contributing to the healing process hundreds of feet away in a sickbed. It's a powerful and deeply bizarre transfer of care. Then comes the temperature. The weapon must be kept in a moderate, temperate state. Digby continues. Never, ever must it be brought close to a fire. This was a critical injunction. He believed that heating the weapon would cause the sympathetic atoms to become agitated and violent. This agitation would be transmitted through the air directly to the wound, causing a raging fever and intense, burning pain in the patient. This, you recall, was the proof in the James Howells story when Digby dried the garter by the fire. Howells' hand immediately started to throb and burn. To the believers, this was an open and shut case of cause and effect. Conversely, if the weapon were kept too cold, it could make the patient feel chilled and shivery. The ideal was a calm, room temperature environment, allowing for a gentle, orderly transfer of spirits. This brings us to a wonderfully odd little piece of historical lore associated with the powder. What to do if you couldn't get the weapon? What if the attacker ran off with his sword? The theory had a workaround for that. You would take a cloth, dip it in the patient's blood from the wound, and then hang the bloody cloth up. You would then apply the powder to the cloth instead of the weapon. The cloth, now saturated with the spirit of the wound, became a proxy, a stand-in for the original weapon. A sympathetic link was established through the blood itself. This little detail shows the flexibility of the magical logic. It could always find a way to make itself applicable. The historical debate around these procedures focuses on their psychological impact. Did these rituals, as nonsensical as they were, actually help? Some sociologists and historians argue that they did. In a way, in a time of medical powerlessness, when a family could do little for a sick relative but watch and pray, the powder of sympathy gave them something to do. It provided a structured, tangible set of actions: polishing the sword, keeping it from the fire, checking it for rust. These were asks that gave a desperate family a sense of agency and control over a terrifying situation. It focused their anxiety onto an external object. This ritualized care, even if directed at the wrong target, may have had a powerful calming effect on the household, which in turn could have created a more restful and positive environment for the patient to heal in. It was a form of collective placebo theater. Digby concludes his instructions. The splinter must remain in its sun-drenched bowl. It must be kept clean, temperate, and undisturbed. This is now the focus of your medical care. He then turns to you, and what he says next is, without a doubt, the most important, most revolutionary, and most unintentionally brilliant part of the entire bizarre procedure. It's the one instruction that will actually determine whether you live or die. He looks you in the eye, his expression serious. As for your hand, he says, with the gravity of a king issuing a decree, you are to do one thing, and one thing only. You lean in, ready for the final piece of magical instruction. Leave it alone. Leave it alone, he repeats, seeing the surprise on your face. That is the most crucial part of the cure. The powder is at work on the agent of the wound. Any interference on your part will only disrupt the sympathetic flow and hinder the healing. This is it. This is the linchpin, the secret ingredient, the magic trick hidden in plain sight. After all the talk of atoms and ether, of solar spirits and cosmic sympathy, the entire, elaborate, pseudoscientific structure rests on this one simple, passive command: do nothing. He elaborates, providing a scientific rationale for this profound inaction. You must not cover the wound with heavy salves or greasy ointments. He instructs. These will block the pores of the skin and prevent the malignant vapors from escaping. He's essentially forbidding the application of the standard medical treatments of the day. Those heavy bombs were often indigenic concoctions of animal fat, plant matter, and various chemicals that could trap dirt and bacteria in the wound, promoting infection. By banning them, he is, for all the wrong reasons, doing exactly the right thing. You must not allow the barber-surgeons to probe it with their curious instruments, he continues, a hint of disdain in his voice for the less enlightened practitioners. Their meddling will only introduce new injuries and agitate the humors. But again, he is inadvertently saving you. The barber-surgeon's unsterilized probe would have almost certainly introduced a host of new bacteria into the puncture wound, turning a minor injury into a major infection. Digby's mystical theory prevents this itagotenic, or ducticose, injury. Keep it clean, of course, he concedes. Wash it gently with clean water, and keep it dry. Cover it only with a light, clean piece of linen to protect it from the filth of the street. But nothing more. The work is being done elsewhere. Your hand is merely the field where the results will manifest. Do not disturb the soil. This command to leave it alone was absolutely revolutionary. It flew in the face of centuries of medical practice. The prevailing belief, as you saw with the barber-surgeon, was that a doctor had to do something. They had to intervene, to be active. A doctor who looked at a wound and said, "Just leave it," would have been seen as negligent, incompetent, or lazy. Patients and their families expected action. They wanted to see the salves, the probes, the cauterizing irons. It was proof that something was being done. Digby's genius was in creating a system that satisfied this psychological need for action, but brilliantly displaced it onto a harmless object. The family gets to feel busy and helpful by polishing the sword. The doctor gets to look like a master of arcane science by mixing his powder. Everyone is engaged in a flurry of activity, and the one thing that actually needs to heal the human body is finally left in peace to do what it does best. This brings up a fascinating and somewhat comical tidbit from the history of medicine: the concept of laudable pus. For a very long time, doctors believed that the formation of thick, white pus in a wound was a good sign. They thought it was the body expelling the malignant humors. They would even try to encourage pus formation. We now know, of course, that pus is a sign of a bacterial infection, the debris of a battle between white blood cells and invading pathogens. It's the very thing you don't want to see. Digby's method, by preventing the introduction of bacteria, would lead to less pus, which a traditional doctor might have seen as a bad sign, but which was, in reality, a sign of clean healing. The historical debate here is one of consciousness. Did Digby know, did he understand, on some intuitive level, that the real benefit of his treatment was its non-interference with the entire elaborate theory of sympathy, a clever Trojan horse designed to sneak the radical idea of benign neglect into mainstream medicine? This is the optimistic view of Digby. It paints him as a brilliant, lateral thinker who saw that the standard treatments were doing more harm than good and invented a fantastical narrative to convince people to stop. The more cynical view is that he had no idea. He was so thoroughly convinced by his own sympathetic theory that the leave it alone part was just a logical consequence of his flawed premises. If the cure is happening in the bowl, then of course you don't touch the wound. He stumbled upon one of the most effective medical principles in history, the body's ability to heal itself completely by accident, while being utterly unsincerely wrong about why it worked. He got the right answer, but for all the wrong reasons. Most historians lean towards the latter interpretation. It's more consistent with his other writings and the general intellectual climate of the age. He wasn't a secret modernist hiding his wisdom in allegory. He was a true believer in a magical, interconnected universe, and the success of his treatment only served to reinforce his bizarre and beautiful delusions. You stand there, absorbing this final, crucial instruction. You are to take your wounded hand, tip it clean, and then just let it be. All the fear and anxiety you felt about the barber's probe and hot iron begins to melt away, replaced by a profound sense of relief. The most advanced, most fashionable, most talked about medical treatment in London has just prescribed the one thing you secretly wanted all along, a whole lot of nothing. You thank Sir Kenelm, your gratitude immense, even if your understanding is shaky. He has given you the most valuable prescription possible, permission to trust your own body. As you and the woman leave his grand house and step back into the noisy, dirty street, you look at your hand not with terror, but with a new sense of calm. The cure is underway. The splinter is in its bath, and your only job now is to wait and watch. You leave Sir Kenelm Digby's grand house with the woman who guided you, stepping back into the noisy reality of the 17th century street. The contrast is jarring. Inside was a world of quiet contemplation, of cosmic theories and polished silver bowls. Outside is the raw, chaotic energy of life, but something has changed in you. The panic that gripped you in the barber-surgeon's shop is gone. In the days that follow, you adhere strictly to Digby's bizarre instructions. It feels strange, almost counterintuitive. Your hand still throbs a little on the first day, and a small, red ring forms around the tiny puncture wound. Every instinct from your modern-day knowledge screams for an antiseptic wipe, a dab of antibiotic ointment, but you resist. Instead, you follow the prescribed ritual. You wash your hand gently with clean water and a simple, harsh soap. You pat it dry with a piece of clean linen. You leave it open to the air as much as possible, covering it only when you have to go outside. And you do your best not to think about it. Meanwhile, you can only assume that somewhere across town, Your little splinter is still enjoying its therapeutic bath on Digby's sunny windowsill. And then, a small but profound miracle happens. The throbbing subsides. The redness begins to fade. The edges of the tiny wound, which had been puffy and angry, start to look clean and dry. No foul-smelling pus appears. No fever materializes. No red streaks begin their terrifying march up your arm. Your body, left to its own devices, is quietly and efficiently doing what it has evolved to do over millions of years. It is healing itself. This is the moment we can finally pull back the curtain and reveal the secret behind the magic of the powder of sympathy. Why did it seem to work so well? Why did it gain so many devoted followers? From kings to commoners, the answer is brutally simple: because it was, in most cases, far better than the alternative. The powder of sympathy was a triumph of what medical historians sometimes call benign neglect. The real therapeutic agent wasn't the vitriol or the ground-up skulls, it was the nothing prescribed in Section 12. Let's do a side-by-side comparison. Imagine two people, both with an identical minor wound. Patient A goes to a traditional barber-surgeon. The surgeon, operating on the best medical knowledge of his time, probably starts by probing the wound with an unsterilized metal instrument, potentially pushing surface bacteria deeper into the tissue. Then, he might apply a poultice made of various organic materials: bread, herbs, animal dung, a surprisingly common ingredient, creating a warm, moist, nutrient-rich environment that is a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Or he might decide to cauterize it with a hot iron, causing massive tissue damage and creating a large burn that is itself highly susceptible to infection. The result: a very high chance of a serious, potentially fatal infection, caused directly by the treatment itself. Now, look at patient B. You go to a practitioner of the powder of sympathy. The treatment is applied to the weapon. Your actual wound is simply washed with water and left alone. It is kept clean and dry. Your immune system, which is a marvel of natural engineering, is given a clean, undisturbed environment to work in. White blood cells swarm the area. Neutrophils and macrophages engulf any invading bacteria, and the body's natural clotting and tissue repair mechanisms kick in. The result: in the vast majority of minor wounds, the body heals itself perfectly without any complications. To the 17th century observer, who knows nothing of germ theory or immunology, the conclusion is obvious. Patient A, who received the standard, aggressive treatment, got terribly sick. Patient B, who received the strange new sympathetic treatment, healed quickly and cleanly. Therefore, the powder of sympathy must be a miraculous cure. They were seeing a clear correlation, but they attributed it to the wrong cause. They credited the mystical powder, not the beneficial absence of harm. Here's a small, related piece of trivia that highlights this principle. In the 19th century, the Hungarian doctor Ignace Semmelweis dramatically reduced mortality rates in his maternity ward simply by insisting that doctors wash their hands before delivering babies. His colleagues were outraged. They found the suggestion insulting that their own hands could be carrying cadaverous particles that harmed patients, and they rejected his findings for decades. It was another case where a simple act of hygiene was more effective than complex medical interventions. But it was resisted because it challenged the established wisdom and pride of the medical profession. The historical debate he rears about the actual success rate. Was the powder of sympathy really that effective? Some modern critics argue that its supporters likely engaged in a lot of confirmation bias and selective reporting. They would trumpet the successes, like the famous James Hull case, and conveniently forget or explain away the failures. If a patient died, it wasn't because the theory was wrong, it was because the weapon wasn't polished correctly, or it was brought to near a fire, or the patient's humors were simply too corrupted to be saved. The system had built-in excuses for failure. However, many historians concede that for a wide range of common injuries, cuts, scrapes, and punctures that weren't immediately fatal, the do-nothing approach of the sympathetic cure would have been statistically far superior to the invasive, mengigiphonic methods of the time. It was to cure all. But it was a harmless all. which often amounted to the same thing. It succeeded by taking the doctor, the single most dangerous element in 17th century medicine, out of the equation. As your hand heals, the skin knitting itself back together with no drama and no fuss, you become a walking, talking advertisement for Digby's method. People who knew of your injury would look at your perfectly healing hand with awe. The powder of sympathy, they would whisper. It truly works. And you, having no other explanation that would make sense to them, could only nod in agreement. You are living proof of one of history's most successful and beautiful medical delusions. Your hand is almost fully healed now. A tiny, pink scar is the only evidence of the ordeal, but the experience has left a much deeper mark on your understanding of this world. You start paying more attention, listening to conversations in the market, observing how people react to sickness and injury, and you begin to see the landscape of 17th century medicine not as a single entity, but as a battlefield of competing ideas. On one side, you have the old guard, the university-trained physicians and the trade guild barber-surgeons. Let's call them team intervention. Their philosophy is rooted in the 1500-year-old tradition of Galen and the Four Humors. They believe the body is a fragile, flawed system prone to imbalance, and that disease is an enemy that must be actively and aggressively fought with purges, bleeding, cauterizing, and complex, often toxic, prescriptions. Their approach is one of intense, hands-on physicality. When you're sick, they are in your face. They are measuring your blood, examining your tongue, smelling your breath, and poking your sores. Their treatments are visceral and often violent. The patient is a passive battlefield upon which the doctor wages a heroic war against the disease. There is a certain drama to it, a sense of doing everything humanly possible. But as you now know, everything humanly possible was often the worst thing you could do. On the other side, you have the upstarts, the radical Sir Kenelm Digby and the proponents of the powder of sympathy. Let's call them Team Magic. Their philosophy is newer, a strange hybrid of ancient Hermeticism and modern corpuscular physics. They believe the body has a natural inclination to heal itself and that the doctor's role is not to attack the body, but to gently and subtly assist this natural process from a distance. Their approach is the polar opposite of team intervention. It is hands-off, remote, and seemingly gentle. The focus of the action is displaced onto an external object, the weapon. The patient's body is treated as a sacred space to be left undisturbed, where team intervention is loud, messy, and painful. Team magic is quiet, clean, and painless, where the old guard offers a heroic struggle. The new guard offers a mysterious, effortless miracle. When you lay it out like this, you can immediately see the appeal. If you're the patient, which would you choose, a man with a glowing hot poker who wants to burn your flesh, or a man with a mystical powder who promises to heal you from a cross down while you rest comfortably? It's not a difficult choice. The powder of sympathy wasn't just a medical alternative, it was a massive improvement in the patient experience. This contrast highlights a quirky detail about 17th century healthcare: the patient's power. While we might think of patients as powerless victims of bad medicine, they did have choices. Especially if they had money, they could choose their physician or surgeon. They could reject a proposed treatment, as you did with the barber, and they could seek out unconventional healers. The medical marketplace was surprisingly diverse and competitive. A new therapy with good marketing, and Digby was a master marketer, could quickly gain popularity and steal customers from the established practitioners. This economic competition was a major driver of the bitter debates between the two camps. The barber-surgeons weren't just offended by Digby's magical nonsense, they were also angry that he was encroaching on their business. So, a fierce war of words erupts. Team intervention attacks team magic on the grounds of logic and theology. They call it demonic sorcery, a pact with the devil, or more mundane lie, a fraudulent deceit. They argue that any cure that doesn't involve direct application to the body is impossible and therefore must be the work of dark forces. They write scathing pamphlets and preach sermons against it. Team magic fires back, armed with Digby's scientific explanations and More importantly, with a growing list of glowing testimonials, they accused the old guard of being ignorant, close-minded, and stuck in the past. They portray them as butchers who torture their patients for profit. They publish books filled with anecdotal evidence of miraculous cures, just like the story of James Howell. They argue that their method is not magic, but a higher, more refined form of natural science, that their dull-witted opponents are too simple to comprehend. The historical debate here centers on whether this conflict was truly a clash between science and magic, or if it was something more complex. Some historians argue that it's a mistake to see the traditional doctors as the scientists in this scenario. Their humoral theory was just as unscientific as Digby's sympathetic magic. It was a battle between two different, equally flawed belief systems. It was old pseudoscience versus new pseudoscience. Other historians suggest the conflict was more about professional territory and social class. The physicians and surgeons had established guilds and royal colleges to protect their monopoly. Digby was an amateur, a gentleman scholar who was operating outside these official structures. Part of the animosity towards him was pure professional jealousy in the defense of their turf. He was a disruptive innovator, and the established industry was trying to shut him down. As you navigate this world with your newly healed hand, you are a living embodiment of this conflict. To the barber-surgeon, you are a fool who fell for a charlatan's trick and got lucky. To Sir Kenelm Digby, you are another successful case study proving his genius. To your neighbors, you are a testament to a wondrous new miracle. You can see the appeal, the logic, and the absurdity of both sides. You have seen the terrifying reality of the old ways and experienced the gentle, if delusional, comfort of the new. The battle for the soul of medicine is raging around you, and your own small wound was, for a moment, at the very heart of it. Your personal story, the tale of the splinter and the miraculous cure, begins to travel. It becomes a small piece of gossip, retold with increasing embellishment in kitchens and taverns. This is how ideas moved in the 17th century, not through mass media, but through a network of personal stories, and as your story circulates, it eventually finds its way to the one place where new, strange, and fashionable ideas were consumed with the greatest appetite: the royal court. The court of King Charles I was a hub of culture, art, and intellectual curiosity. The king himself, along with his queen, Henrietta Maria, were patrons of science and the arts. They were surrounded by the brightest and most ambitious minds in the kingdom, all vying for royal favor. In this environment, novelty was a valuable currency. A new philosophical idea, a new style of painting, or a new medical marvel was a ticket to attention and influence. Sir Kenelm Digby was already a prominent figure at court. He was a trusted diplomat and a charismatic personality, but his powder of sympathy gave him a special kind of celebrity. It made him not just a courtier, but a man of wonders. He wasn't just talking about politics, he was demonstrating the secret laws of the universe in a silver bowl. Imagine a scene at Whitehall Palace. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax, candles, and expensive perfume. Courtiers in shimmering silks and velvets are engaged in witty conversation. The king is present. At some point, the conversation turns to Digby's powder. Someone mentions the latest incredible cure, perhaps even yours. Skeptics and believers would have immediately squared off. A court physician, loyal to the old ways of Galen, might scoff, "Your Majesty, it is mere trickery, an illusion preying on the desperate." But then a nobleman, perhaps a friend of James Howell, would counter, "I saw Howell's hand with my own eyes." The surgeons had given up, and Sir Kenelm healed him in an afternoon without so much as touching him. Call it what you will, but it works. This is the perfect environment for Digby's ideas to flourish. The court was less interested in the dry, methodical proofs of a laboratory and more interested in a good story, a dramatic demonstration, and a charismatic champion. Digby provided all three: his performance of the cure, the theatrical unlocking of the chest, the dramatic pronouncements. The scientific lecture was perfectly calibrated for this audience. And the king himself was intrigued. King Charles I, like many rulers of his time, had a genuine interest in what we would call science and alchemy. But for a king, this interest wasn't just a hobby, it was also about power. The belief was that a monarch who could understand and command the secret forces of nature was a more powerful ruler. Alchemy promised to turn lead into gold, which had obvious financial benefits. Astrology promised to reveal the future, and new medical cures, like Digby's powder, promised to protect the most valuable asset in the kingdom, the royal body. So the king doesn't just hear about the powder, he wants to own the recipe. According to Digby, King Charles I paid him the princely sum of £500 for the secret to making the powder of sympathy. To put that in perspective, a skilled labourer at the time might earn £10.15 a year. It was a fortune. This royal endorsement was the ultimate seal of approval. It elevated the powder of sympathy from a fringe curiosity to a legitimate, crown-sanctioned remedy. This brings up a fascinating tidbit about royalty and health the king's touched. For centuries in England and France, it was believed that the monarch had the God-given power to heal a specific disease called desciorevula, a form of tuberculosis that caused swollen glands in the neck. The disease was even known as the king's evil. There were elaborate public ceremonies where hundreds of sick people would line up, and the king would simply touch them, one by one, to cure them. King Charles I was a great believer in this, untouched tens of thousands of people during his reign. So, for a king who already believed he had a divine, sympathetic healing power in his own hands, the idea of a powder that worked on similar principles would have seemed perfectly plausible. The historical debate here concerns the king's motivation. Was Charles I a true believer, genuinely convinced by Digby's cosmic theories, or was he a pragmatist? Some historians argue that the king was a deeply pious man who saw the world through a lens of divine signs and wonders, and Digby's natural magic fit perfectly into this worldview. Others suggest a more political motive. By patronizing a new, modern science, Charles was positioning himself as a forward-thinking, enlightened monarch. Owning the secret to this miracle cure was a status symbol. Like owning a famous painting by Van Eyck, another of his protégés, it was a way to enhance his royal mystique and prestige. Whatever the reason, the effect was undeniable. Once the king bought the recipe, the powder's fame exploded. It became the height of fashion. Every nobleman and wealthy merchant wanted to have a vial of this royal powder in their medicine chest. It was a sign that you were sophisticated, well-connected, and on the cutting edge of science. The demand created a market, and apothecaries began to produce and sell their own versions of the powder, of varying quality and with dubious ingredients. The little splinter wound on your hand has now had far-reaching consequences. It has played a small part in a chain of events that has led to a royal endorsement, cementing the fame and fortune of Sir Kenelm Digby and turning his bizarre, magical cure into one of the most fashionable medical treatments in all of Europe. You didn't just get healed, you witnessed the birth of a phenomenon. With the king's seal of approval, the powder of sympathy is no longer just a medical treatment, it's a cultural phenomenon. It escapes the confines of the court and begins to spread across Europe with the speed of fashionable gossip. You start to see its influence everywhere, a testament to how an idea, no matter how strange, can capture the public imagination. The primary vectors for this intellectual contagion are the salons and the printing press. In the grand houses of London and Paris, wealthy and educated men and women would gather for salons, evenings of food, wine, and, most importantly, conversation. Here, the latest news, art, and scientific theories were dissected and debated. The powder of sympathy was the perfect salon topic. It was sensational. It involved a charismatic celebrity like Digby. It brushed up against philosophy and theology. And it allowed people to sound intelligent and forward-thinking by discussing atoms and the other. Imagine you're a fly on the wall at one of these gatherings. A woman might recount, with breathless excitement, how her cousin's fencing wound was healed in 3 days. A skeptical physician in the corner would grumble about charlatanism, while a young man, eager to show off his modern education, would start explaining the principles of corpuscular effluvia. The debate itself was the entertainment. The powder's truth was almost secondary to its value as a conversation piece. Then there was the printing press. In 1658, Digby gave a famous lecture on the Powder of Sympathy in Montpellier, France, a center of medical learning. It was a masterful performance, delivered to a skeptical audience of doctors and scholars. He laid out the whole theory, from James Howell's wound to the atomic principles, with his characteristic charm and unshakable confidence. This lecture was promptly translated into English, Latin, German, and Dutch and published in book form. This little book became an international bestseller. Now, anyone who could read or have it read to them could learn the secrets of the sympathetic cure. The book was Digby's brilliant content marketing strategy. It codified the myth, gave it a scientific-sounding foundation, and spread it far beyond the reach of his own voice. Suddenly, a doctor in Amsterdam or a scholar in Rome could be having the same arguments as the courtiers in London. As the idea spreads, it becomes a kind of intellectual fashion accessory. To be in the know, you had to have an opinion on Digby's powder. It was like the hot new startup or tech trend of its day. People weren't just using it, they were investing in it, both financially and intellectually. It was seen as part of a move towards a new science, one that rejected the dusty old books of the ancients and embraced bold, new, experimental ideas. The fact that the core idea was ancient magic dressed in new clothes was an irony lost on most of its proponents. This brings us to a wonderfully silly, and very telling, little piece of history the weapons solve. Digby's powder was the most famous version, but it was part of a broader trend. Various weapon swords became popular across Europe. These were ointments that you would apply to the sword or knife that caused a wound. Recipes abounded, often involving things like human fat, moss from a dead man's skull snee, our old friend, and, of course, blood from the weapon. It was a full-blown fad. There were heated debates not about if the weapon salve worked, but about which recipe was the most effective. It was a market ripe for what we would today call dupes or knockoffs. Apothecaries across the continent cooked up their own versions, giving them fancy Latin names and selling them to a gullible public. The historical debate here concerns the reason for its widespread appeal. Why was the 17th century public so ready to believe this? One school of thought emphasizes the top-down influence, the endorsement of elite kings, nobles, and famous intellectuals like Digby made it respectable and desirable. People adopted it because it was fashionable, a way to emulate their social superiors. Another school of thought argues for a bottom-up explanation. They suggest that the core idea of sympathetic magic was already deeply ingrained in popular folklore and folk medicine for centuries. People were already secretly tying charms to things or using cures like remedies. Digby didn't invent a new idea, he just took an existing, popular belief, gave it a fancy scientific-sounding name and a celebrity endorsement, and sold it back to the public. He was successful not because he introduced something new, but because he validated something people already, on some level, believed. The truth is likely a combination of both. The elite endorsement made it fashionable, and the underlying folk magic made it feel intuitively correct. So the powder that healed your hand is now a European sensation. It's the subject of best-selling books, the topic of heated debates in elegant salons, and the source of a booming cottage industry of knockoff sods and powders. It has become more than just a cure, it's a symbol of a particular moment in time. A moment of profound confusion and excitement, when the old world of magic and the new world of science were locked in a strange, beautiful, and utterly bizarre dance. You look at your simple, healed hand and realize it's connected to this vast international craze, a quiet testament to the power of a good story to change the world, even if the story isn't true. As the powder of sympathy becomes a sensation, its underlying logic, the idea of action at a distance and treating a proxy instead of the patient, begins to bleed into other areas of medicine and folk belief. It's as if a new software has been installed in the collective mind, and people start running all sorts of strange programs with it. If you can heal a sword wound by treating the sword, what else can you do with this powerful principle? You start to hear about these other sympathetic cures, whispered in the market or shared as household wisdom. They range from the plausible to the utterly fantastical, but they all share the same core logic. One of the most common applications was in treating nosebleed. The sympathetic cure for a nosebleed was not to pinch the nose or apply a cold compress to the head. Instead, the patient was to write, in their own blood, a specific Latin phrase or charm on a piece of paper. This piece of paper was then worn around the neck or, in some versions, held by another person who would concentrate on it. The belief was that the spirit of the blood was now in the ink, and by controlling the paper, you could command the bleeding to stop. Then there were treatments for fevers. A common sympathetic cure for a fever involved taking the patient's fingernail clippings and toenail clippings. These would be sealed in a small bag with a live spider and then hung up in the rafters of the house. The logic was gruesome but consistent. The spider, a cold creature, would sympathetically draw the heat of the fever out of the nail clippings, and by extension, out of the patient's body. The spider was the scapegoat. Suffering so, the patient could be cooled. But perhaps the most widespread and enduring sympathetic folk remedy was for the removal of warts. The variations are endless, but they all follow a pattern. A popular method was to rub the wart with a piece of meat, often bacon. Then, you had to bury that piece of meat in the ground. As the meat rotted away in secret, the wart would sympathetically wither and disappear from your hand. Another version involved selling your warts. You would touch each wart with a separate pebble, then put the pebbles in a bag and leave it on a public road. Whoever found the bag and picked it up would buy your warts, meaning they would get them, and yours would vanish. This last one gives us a fascinating little tidbit about the social aspect of these cures. Notice the element of transference. The problem isn't just healed, it's passed on to someone else. This reflects a worldview where misfortune isn't just a random event, it's a tangible quantity that can be moved around. Your gain is someone else's loss. It's a zero-sum game of health and sickness, played out through these strange, ritualistic transactions. The logic of sympathy also extended to agriculture. To ensure a good harvest, a farmer might take a handful of seeds from the bag and marry them to a piece of fertile earth in a small ceremony before planting the rest. This symbolic act was believed to create a sympathetic bond that would encourage the entire crop to grow strong. The historical debate around these folk remedies is about their relationship to official medicine. Like Digby's powder, did these popular beliefs trickle up from the peasantry to influence intellectuals like Digby, or did the scientific theories of the elite trickle down and give a new, more sophisticated gloss to old wives' tales? It was almost certain near to Way Street. The intellectual elite and the common folk were breathing the same cultural air. A farmer burying bacon for his warts and a nobleman treating his sword with a weapon software operating on the exact same magical principle. One was just wearing a lab coat, so to speak. Historians who study folklore, known as folklorists, see these practices not as failed science, but as a form of cultural expression. These rituals provided a sense of control in a world filled with uncertainty. They were a way of imposing order on the chaos of disease and misfortune. The rituals had a narrative structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end that was psychologically satisfying, regardless of the physical outcome. Performing the ritual was a way of saying, I am not helpless. I am taking action. So you find yourself in a world saturated with this thinking. The boundaries between your body and the world around you feel strangely permeable. Your nail clippings, your blood, even your warts, are not just disposable parts of you, they are extensions of you, carrying your essence and capable of being used to influence you from afar. The splinter that wounded you wasn't just a piece of wood, it became a temporary part of you, a reluctant limb that could be treated on your behalf. This worldview is both terrifying and enchanting. Terrifying, because it means you are vulnerable to unseen forces and the malicious actions of others who might get a hold of your hair or fingernails. This is the logic behind curses and voodoo dolls. But it's also enchanting, because it suggests a world that is not cold and mechanical, but alive with meaning, poetry, and hidden connections. It's a world where burying a piece of bacon can be an act of profound hope. The Powder of Sympathy wasn't an isolated anomaly, it was just the most famous and well-marketed product of a deeply ingrained magical operating system. While the Powder of Sympathy enjoys its celebrity status in royal courts and fashionable salons, not everyone is buying it. In the universities, in the pulpits of churches, and in the shops of rival practitioners, a growing chorus of skepticism and outrage begins to make itself heard. You start to hear the counter-arguments, the voices of reason and reaction trying to push back against this popular new trend. The opposition came from two main camps, who, ironically, probably disagreed with each other as much as they disagreed with Digby, the orthodox medical establishment, and the conservative theologians. First, let's listen to the doctors, the physicians and surgeons of the team intervention we met earlier are, to put it mildly, furious. Their objections are a mix of professional pride, economic anxiety, and what they considered to be sound, logical reasoning. A typical argument from a member of the Royal College of Physicians would sound something like this: it is a fundamental principle, established since the time of the great Galen, that a remedy must have direct contact with the afflicted part of the body. To claim that a powder applied to a sword in London can heal a man in Bristol is to defy not only medicine, but reason itself. It is a logical absurdity. They would point out that there is no observable physical link between the weapon and the wound, since they couldn't see the connection. They concluded it couldn't exist. Their science, based on direct sensory evidence, or so they thought, rejected action at a distance as impossible. They also attacked it as a lazy and cowardly form of medicine. They took pride in their difficult, hands-on work. They were the ones getting their hands dirty, literally, wrestling with disease. They saw Digby as a glove-wearing doctor, an effete aristocrat who didn't have the stomach for real medicine. His method was a shirking of a doctor's duty to intervene. Then came the theologians. While the doctors attacked the powder for being illogical, the churchmen attacked it for being too logical in its own magical way, a way that bypassed God. A Puritan preacher, for instance, might thunder from the pulpit, "This so-called Powder of Sympathy is a work of the devil. It is a diabolical compact, a form of witchcraft masquerading as science. Healing comes from God alone, through prayer and his divine providence, or through the lawful application of his natural remedies. This is an appeal to occult forces, an attempt to usurp God's power. To put your faith in a worldly powder instead of the Almighty is a damnable sin." Their argument was that any cure that couldn't be explained by the known, God-given laws of nature must be supernatural, and since it didn't seem to be a divine miracle which had its own specific criteria, it must be demonic. The secrecy of the recipe, the esoteric language of sympathy, the whisper of alchemy, it all smelled of black magic to them. They warned their flocks that to use the powder was to endanger not just their bodies, but their immortal souls. Here we come across a very specific and interesting term from the period, judicial astrology. This was the branch of astrology that claimed to predict the future of individuals and nations. Many theologians considered it a sinful practice because it implied that human destiny was written in the stars, not determined by God's will and human free will. They often lumped sympathetic magic into the same category. Both were seen as attempts to access a forbidden knowledge and power that belonged only to God. The historical debate here is about the true nature of this opposition. Was it a genuine intellectual and theological disagreement? Or was it, as Digby's supporters claimed, just sour grapes? The defenders of the powder would argue that their critics were simply dinosaurs, afraid of new ideas that threatened their comfortable worldview and their income. They would say that the doctors were just jealous and the priests were just superstitious. Modern historians try to be more charitable to the critics. They argue that, given the premises of a 17th century worldview, the objections were perfectly rational. If you believe, as the physicians did, that all medicine must be physical, then the powder is nonsense. If you believe, as the theologians did, that all supernatural power is either divine or demonic, then the powder is spiritually dangerous. Their conclusions were logical, based on their starting assumptions. They weren't necessarily being stupid or malicious, they were defending their understanding of how the world worked. They were the gatekeepers of intellectual and spiritual order, and Digby was a trespass. So the public square becomes a noisy, contentious place. Pamphlets are written, attacking Digby and his followers. In response, other pamphlets are published, defending him. You might see a poster nailed to a post outside a church, warning the faithful against the sympathetic sorcery, while in a nearby bookshop, Digby's best-selling lecture is proudly displayed in the window. The controversy turns Digby into an even more polarizing figure. To his fans, he is a persecuted genius, a Galileo of medicine, bravely fighting against ignorance and superstition. To his detractors, he is a dangerous heretic, a smooth-talking charlatan leading people astray with his seductive, magical fantasies. The man who healed your hand is now at the center of a full-blown culture war, a battle for the very definition of truth, science, and faith in the 17th century. The war of words is not a brief skirmish. It becomes a long, drawn-out conflict, a pamphlet war that rages for decades across Europe. This isn't a debate held in a single room, but a vast, slow-motion argument conducted through the medium of print. You are living in the middle of this intellectual battle, and you can see the ammunition being fired from both sides. One week, you might see a new publication for sale, written by a prominent physician. Its title would be something dramatic like, A Refutation of the Vain and Impious Folly Known as the Sympathetic Cure, wherein its errors of philosophy and dangers to the soul are plainly exposed. Inside, the author would systematically attempt to tear Digby's theory apart. He would mock the idea of solar spirits and atomic effluvia as pure fantasy. He'd cite the ancient authorities, Aristotle and Galen, to prove that such action at a distance is impossible. He might even include a few horror stories carefully selected or perhaps fabricated of patients who used the powder and came to a terrible end. A few months later, a response would appear on the bookstalls. It would be penned by a supporter of Digby, perhaps a young, ambitious philosopher or even Digby himself, writing under a pseudonym. The title would be equally combative, A Defense of the True and Natural Magic of Sympathy, proving its accordance with both reason and faith, with an answer to the slanderous objections of ignorant men. This pamphlet would praise Digby as a modern visionary. It would be filled with glowing testimonials, detailed case studies of miraculous recoveries like yours, and complex diagrams illustrating how the sympathetic atoms travel through the ether. It would accuse the traditional doctors of being butchers and the theologians of being narrow-minded bigots, who would have condemned the miracles of Jesus Christ himself if they didn't fit their rigid doctrines. This back and forth was the 17th century equivalent of a bitter argument unfolding on social media, but played out over years instead of minutes. The arguments became increasingly personal and vitriolic. The critics called Digby an arch-quack and a deluded enthusiast. His defenders called their opponents hidebound Gale onists and envious pedants. One of the most famous and articulate critics was the Anglican priest and scholar, Nathaniel High Moore. In the 1652, he wrote a book on the history of generation and took the opportunity to launch a blistering attack on Digby's theory. Highmore argued that the powder's apparent success was not due to sympathy but to a combination of fraud, coincidence, and the devil. He was a primary voice for the it's either a trick or it's witchcraft school of thought. On the other side, you had passionate defenders across Europe. In Germany, the weapon salve had its own champion in the physician Rudolf Goclenius the Younger, who engaged in similar long-distance debates with his critics. These men formed a kind of informal brotherhood of believers, translating each other's works and citing each other as authorities. A particularly charming and odd detail from this debate is the use of poetry. It wasn't just dry, academic prose. Some of the arguments were made in verse. You might find a short, satirical poem mocking the sword-salving quakes, or a heroic ode praising Sir Kenelm Digby as a new Esculapius, the Greek god of medicine. The great poet John Dryden even wrote a poem that referenced Digby's cure, showing just how deeply it had penetrated the cultural consciousness. The historical debate here is about the effect of this long argument. Did it actually change anyone's mind? The modern view is that it probably didn't. These pamphlets were not aimed at persuading the other side. They were written for the people who already agreed with the author. They were about reinforcing the beliefs of your own tribe and rallying the troops. A physician would read the attack on Digby and nod along, feeling his own views validated. A supporter of Digby would read the defense and feel proud to be on the side of progress and enlightenment. The debate served to harden the battle lines, not to erase them. What it did do, however, was keep the topic alive. The constant controversy was fantastic marketing. Every time a critic wrote a pamphlet attacking the Powder of Sympathy, it just brought more attention to it. The debate ensured that the powder remained a hot topic for discussion in salons, universities, and coffee houses for the better part of a century. So you exist in the state of permanent, low-grade controversy. Your own healing is a data point, a piece of anecdotal evidence that can be used by either side. To the believers, you are proof. To the skeptics, you are a statistical anomaly, a lucky break, or a dupe who doesn't understand what really happened. You might find yourself in a conversation at a tavern where the topic comes up. One man will praise Digby's genius. Another will curse his name as a heretic. They might even look to you, the one with the first-hand experience, to settle the argument. But you can't. Your experience confirms the what, but it can't explain the why. You saw the magic work, but you're beginning to understand that the real magic wasn't in the powder at all. As you listen to the endless, circular debates between Digby's champions and his critics, you start to realize something profound. Both sides are missing the point. The believers are obsessed with the powder, the sword, and the sympathetic atoms. The skeptics are obsessed with proving that action at a distance is impossible or demonic. But they are all ignoring the most important actor in the entire drama, the patient's mind. You think back to your own experience, when you stood in the barber-surgeon shop, facing the hot iron. You were filled with terror and despair. Your body was tense. Your heart was pounding. You felt hopeless. Then, you went to see Sir Kenelm Digby. He was calm, confident, and authoritative. He offered you a cure that was painless, sophisticated, and endorsed by the king. He told you a powerful story about James Howell's miraculous recovery. He gave you a complex, scientific explanation that made you feel like you were a part of a cutting-edge experiment. And most importantly, he gave you a profound sense of hope. After you left his house, you felt relieved, calm, and optimistic. You believed you were being healed by a powerful, mysterious force. You were relaxed. You slept better. You weren't constantly prodding your wound, sick with worry. Could this mental and emotional shift have had a physical effect? You have stumbled, intuitively, upon the concept we now call the placebo effect. A placebo is a substance or treatment with no active therapeutic ingredient, which nonetheless can produce a real, physical improvement in a patient's condition simply because the patient believes it will work. The patient's expectation of getting better can, in itself, trigger the body's own healing mechanisms. The Powder of Sympathy is perhaps one of the most perfect, large-scale examples of the placebo effect in medical history. It had all the necessary ingredients to be a powerful placebo. First, it had a charismatic and authoritative provider, Dr. Tapchuk, a modern researcher at Harvard who studies the placebo effect, has shown that the provider's warmth, confidence, and empathy can significantly enhance the placebo response. Sir Kenelm Digby was the master of this. He didn't just give you a powder, he gave you a performance of healing. Second, it had a compelling narrative. The story of James Howell, the secret recipe from the Carmelite monk, the royal endorsement, all these elements created a powerful myth that made the treatment seem credible and extraordinary. Believing in a good story can be a potent medicine. Third, it involved a ritual. The careful mixing of the powder, the placing of the weapon in the sun, the daily polishing. These ritualistic actions focused the patient's and family's attention and reinforced their belief in the cure's power. Rituals can have a profound psychological effect, reducing anxiety and creating a sense of order and control. And here's a fascinating little detail that adds another layer to this: the color of the powder. Modern studies have shown that the color of a placebo pill can influence its effect. For example, blue pills are often associated with calming or sedative effects, while red or orange pills are seen as stimulants. Digby's powder was a vitriolic blue-green. Is it possible that this cool, soothing color contributed, on a subconscious level, to the belief that it would cool the heat of an inflamed wound? It's a tantalizing, it's incredible idea. The historical debate here is a relatively modern one, as the concept of the placebo effect was not formally studied until the 20th century. The debate isn't if the placebo effect was at play with the powder of sympathy. Most historians agree it was a major factor, but rather how much it contributed. Was the powder's success entirely due to the placebo effect combined with the benign neglect we discussed earlier, or was there more to it? Some medical historians and anthropologists argue that we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss the subjective experience of healing. They suggest that the powerful emotional state of hope and belief induced by the placebo can have real, measurable physiological effects. It can reduce stress hormones like cortisol, which can suppress the immune system. It can release endorphins, the body's natural painkillers. In this view, the placebo effect isn't just in the mind, it's a real mind-body phenomenon, a form of self-healing triggered by belief. The powder of sympathy, then, wasn't just doing nothing, it was actively creating the optimal psychological and physiological conditions for the body to heal itself. You look at your healed hand again. The neat pink scar seems like a testament to this complex interaction. The benign neglect of the treatment saved you from the barber's harmful interventions, but the placebo effect, the powerful belief instilled in you by Digby's performance, may have done something more. It replaced your fear with hope. And in doing so, it may have turned your own mind into the most potent medicine of all. The great irony is that Sir Kenelm Digby, for all his talk of atoms and ether, had stumbled upon the power of psychology. He was a pioneer of psychosomatic medicine without ever knowing it. He thought he was treating a sword with a powder, but his real genius was in treating a patient spirit with a story. You've lived in this world for some time now. You've seen the medicine of the past and the strange, magical alternative. You've witnessed the power of belief and the quiet triumph of the body's own healing wisdom. But the world is not static. All around you, the intellectual ground is shifting, slowly but seismically. The magical, interconnected cosmos of Sir Kenelm Digby is beginning to fade, and a new, colder, more mechanical universe is taking its place. The dawn of the age of reason is breaking. You feel this shift not as a single event, but as a series of small changes in the way people talk and think. The buzzwords are changing. You hear less about sympathy, spirits, and essences, and more about reason, evidence, and experiment. The driving force behind this change is a new generation of thinkers, natural philosophers who are building on the work of people like Francis Bacon and René Descartes. They are creating what we now call the scientific method. They argue that knowledge should not be based on ancient texts, divine revelation, or poetic analogies. It should be based on systematic observation, repeatable experiments, and logical deduction. You might find yourself at a coffee house, a new and popular type of establishment that is becoming a hotbed of intellectual exchange. Here, you would see men poring over new publications from the Royal Society, of which Digby himself was, ironically, a founding member. The Society's motto, Nudis in verba, take nobody's word for it, is a direct challenge to the old way of thinking. It's a declaration of independence from the authority of the past. These new scientists would have torn the powder of sympathy to shreds, but with a different kind of argument than the old doctors and theologians. They wouldn't have called it demonic. They would have called it unproven. A man in the coffee house, perhaps a young member of the Royal Society, might say Sir Kenelm's tale of James Howell is a fine anecdote, but it is not evidence to prove his theory. He would need to conduct a proper trial. He would need 20 men with identical wounds. 10 would have their weapons treated with the powder. 10 would have their weapons treated with plain water. All other conditions must be kept identical. We would record the outcomes meticulously. If the 10 treated with the powder heal significantly faster, then, and only then, can we begin to entertain his hypothesis. This is the language of the controlled experiment. It's a way of thinking that is designed to filter out coincidence, bias, and the placebo effect. To a worldview based on storytelling and testimonials, this kind of rigorous, statistical thinking is a mortal threat. The Powder of Sympathy could never survive such a trial, because its magic relies on the very things belief, ritual, and a lack of controls that the scientific method seeks to eliminate. Another key development you witness is the rise of new technologies, particularly in the field of optics. The invention and improvement of the microscope is about to open up a universe that Digby, for all his talk of invisible particles, could never have imagined. Here we have a wonderful, specific historical moment. In the 1672, a Dutch draper and amateur scientist named Anthony van Leeuwenhoek grinds his own tiny, powerful lenses and starts looking at everything he can get his hands on. He looks at a drop of pond water and is stunned to see a world teeming with tiny, swimming creatures, which he calls animalcules. This is humanity's first glimpse into the microbial world. Leeuwenhoek doesn't know what these creatures are, and he certainly doesn't connect them to disease, but his discovery is the first crucial step towards germ theory. He has provided the first observational evidence that there is a vast, unseen biological world that exists independently of our own. The historical debate here is about the pace of this change. Was there a sudden scientific revolution that swept away the old magical beliefs in a few short decades, or was the process much more gradual and patchy? The traditional view used to be of a swift, dramatic revolution. More recently, however, historians have argued that the transition was slow and messy. For a long time, the new science and the old magic coexisted. Even the great Isaac Newton, the ultimate figure of the scientific revolution, spent more time on alchemy and biblical chronology than he did on physics and mathematics. The disenchantment of the world, as sociologist Max Weber would later call it, was a process that took centuries. But the seeds are being planted. The new scientific mindset is like a slow-acting acid, gradually dissolving the sympathetic threads that held Digby's universe together. The demand for empirical proof, the logic of controlled experiments, and the revelations of the microscope are all chipping away at the foundations of his beautiful, magical, and ultimately wrong theory. You can feel the tide turning. The Powder of Sympathy, which once seemed like the cutting edge of modern science, is beginning to look old-fashioned, a relic of a more credulous and poetic age. It still has its believers, of course, folk traditions die hard, but in the intellectual centers of Europe, the conversation is moving on. Hindu. More powerful kind of magic is on the rise, the magic of verifiable, evidence-based science. The world revealed by Leeuwenhoek's microscope is, for a long time, just a curiosity. A fascinating but seemingly irrelevant zoo of tiny swimming things. The connection between these animalcules and the infection in your hand is a puzzle that will take another 200 years for humanity to solve. But the very existence of this invisible world plants a seed of doubt that will eventually grow to choke the life out of theories like the Powder of Sympathy. As the 17th century gives way to the 18th, you can sense the explanation for sickness beginning to shift. The old humoral theory is still around, as are the folk beliefs in sympathy and magic. But a new idea is gaining ground, the miasma theory. This theory holds that diseases, particularly epidemics like cholera and the plague, are caused by miasma, or bad air. This air is thought to be a kind of poisonous vapor or mist, filled with particles from decaying organic matter. Swamped, Graveyards and garbage heaps were considered dangerous places because they produced this foul, disease-carrying air. On the surface, miasma theory doesn't sound much better than humoral or sympathetic theory. It's still wrong, but it represents a crucial step forward. It moves the cause of disease from an internal imbalance, humors, or a mystical connection, sympathy, to an external, environmental agent. Sickness is no longer just your body failing you, it's something from the outside world invading you. This is a profound conceptual leap. This new theory leads to changes in public health. Cities begin to focus on sanitation, on cleaning the streets, improving drainage, and moving cemeteries outside the city walls, all in an effort to combat the deadly miasma. These actions, undertaken for the wrong reason, often had the right effect, as they also reduced the breeding grounds for the rats, fleas, and bacteria that were the true culprits. But the real death blow to the old ways comes much later, with the work of giants like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the 19th century. They are the ones who will finally connect unwoke animalcules to disease. Through a series of brilliant unelegant experiments, they will prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that specific microscopic organisms, bacteria and viruses, cause specific diseases. This is the birth of germ theory. Germ theory is the ultimate mythbuster. It provides a clear, verifiable, and universally applicable explanation for what happened to your hand when the splinter pierced your skin. It wasn't malignant vapors or an imbalance of humus that caused the problem. It was bacteria. Staphylococcus and streptococcus, invisible passengers on the splinter and your own skin, were introduced into the warm, nutrient-rich environment of your subcutaneous tissue. There, they began to multiply rapidly. Your immune system responded, sending white blood cells to fight the invaders. The resulting inflammation, redness, and pain were the signs of this microscopic battle. If your immune system had lost, the bacteria would have entered your bloodstream, causing sepsis, the blood poisoning that people in the 17th century so rightly feared. With this new knowledge, the old cures are exposed for what they were. The barber-surgeon's unsterilized probe was a delivery system for more bacteria. His poultices were bacterial incubators. The powder of sympathy, on the other hand, worked precisely because it did nothing to facilitate this bacterial invasion. Its magic was that it created an environment of non-interference. Here's a specific and fascinating detail that illustrates this transition perfectly: the story of Lister's antiseptic surgery. In the 1862, the British surgeon Joseph Lister read Pasteur's work. He realized that the terrible post-surgical infections that killed so many of his patients were caused by these germs entering the wounds. So he started spraying the operating room, the surgical instruments, and the wound itself with carbolic acid, a chemical known to kill germs. The results were astounding. Mortality rates plummeted. Surgery was transformed from a desperate gamble into a life-saving procedure. Lister had found a real way to kill the invisible enemies. The historical debate here is a subtle one, about why it took so long for germ theory to be accepted. It wasn't an instant success. Many doctors, even in the late 19th century, clung to the old miasma and humoral theories. Why part of it was simple inertia and resistance to change, but another part was a problem of scale. It was hard for people to believe that something so small it couldn't be seen could kill a creature as large and complex as a human being. It seemed disproportionate. The idea of a vast, miasmic cloud of poison somehow felt more appropriate to the scale of a plague than the idea of a few invisible bugs. It took decades of overwhelming evidence to convince the medical establishment. With the triumph of germ theory, the powder of sympathy is finally, definitively, relegated to the museum of curious but failed ideas. Its beautiful, poetic logic of sympathetic connection is replaced by the brutal, clinical reality of a microbial war. The world has become less enchanted, but infinitely safer. You can now look back at Digby's cure not with belief or anger, but with a kind of nostalgic fondness. It was a beautiful, intricate, and deeply human attempt to make sense of suffering in a world that lacked the tools to see the real enemy. The invisible world that Leeuwenhoek discovered has finally been identified, not as a collection of harmless animal cures, but as the true agent of life and death that everyone had been searching for all along. The dust has settled. The scientific revolution has triumphed. Germ theory is the new gospel. In this new, brightly lit world of reason and evidence, what becomes of the man at the center of our story? How does history finally judge Sir Kenelm Digby? The verdict is, to put it mildly, complicated. Digby died in 1665, long before his most famous theory was definitively debunked. He died celebrated and respected, a giant of his age. But, in the centuries that followed, his reputation has been on a rollercoaster ride. For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, during the height of the Enlightenment and the Victorian era, Digby was often dismissed as a curious footnote, a prime example of the foolishness and credulity of the past. Thinkers of the Age of Reason looked back on his sympathetic powder with scorn and ridicule. They saw him as a charlatan, a quirk, or at best, a brilliant mind hopelessly lost in the fog of superstition. His science was seen as an embarrassment, a dead end on the road to progress. His alchemical pursuits and his mystical worldview were proof that he wasn't a real scientist like Newton or Boyle. He was lumped in with the astrologers and the magicians, a relic of a thankfully bygone era. But in the 20th century, a more nuanced reevaluation began to take place. Historians of science started to look at figures like Digby not through the lens of our modern knowledge, but within the context of their own time. They began to ask not was he right, but why did he think the way he did? This new approach paints a much more interesting picture. It acknowledges his profound contradictions. Yes, he was a champion of a magical cure, but he was also a founding member of the Royal Society, the very institution that would champion the scientific method that made his cure obsolete. He was a man with one foot firmly planted in the mystical, hermetic tradition of the Renaissance and the other stretching tentatively into the new, mechanical world of the scientific revolution. Some historians now see him as a crucial transitional figure. He was trying to find a bridge between these two worlds. His attempt to explain the magic of sympathy using the science of atoms and ether can be seen as a noble, if failed, attempt to create a unified theory of everything, to prove that the universe was both meaningful and mechanical. He wasn't rejecting science for magic, he was trying to prove that magic was a form of science. This brings up a fascinating tidbit about his other scientific work. Digby was one of the first people to observe the importance of what he called vital air, what we now know as oxygen, for the life of plants. In one experiment, he demonstrated that plants could not grow in a vacuum. This was a genuinely important and forward-thinking piece of experimental biology. The man who championed the nonsensical powder of sympathy was also contributing legitimate, foundational knowledge to the field of botany. This is the Digby paradox. How can someone be so right about one thing and so spectacularly wrong about another? The ongoing historical debate about Digby is essentially about his sincerity. Was he a true believer in his own sympathetic theories, or was he a brilliant, cynical opportunist who saw a market for a painless cure and concocted a fantastic story to sell it, all while secretly knowing that its real benefit was non-interference? The sincere camp argues that his writings are too detailed, too passionate, and too philosophically consistent to be the work of a fraud. He genuinely believed he had discovered one of the universe's great secrets. His successes, which were, as we know, due to benign neglect and placebo, only confirmed his belief. He was a genius who was led astray by a beautiful idea. The cynical camp, well, Smollett, suggests that a man as intelligent and well-read as Digby must have had some inkling that his theory was on shaky ground. Perhaps he didn't believe the whole cosmic story, but he saw that the treatment worked, and he constructed the story as a necessary fiction to get people to accept the radical do-nothing approach. In this view, he was a kind of medical pragmatist, using a noble lie to save people from the harmful interventions of his colleagues. Most likely, the truth is somewhere in the muddled middle. He probably believed his own theories, but like any good performer, He was also not above embellishing the details and managing his own public image to enhance his fame and fortune. He was both a sincere philosopher and a masterful showman. So the final verdict on Sir Kenelm Digby is that there is no final verdict. He remains a wonderfully enigmatic figure. He was not a simple hero of science or a villainous quack. He was a product of his time, a time of immense intellectual ferment, where the old maps of reality were being discarded and new ones were still being drawn. He represents the glorious, messy, and often contradictory human struggle to understand the world. The man who healed your hand was a brilliant, flawed, and utterly fascinating human being, a perfect symbol of an age when anything, even healing a wound by washing a sword, seemed possible. Your journey is almost over. You've traveled from a tiny splinter wound to the grand theories of the cosmos, from the king's court to the frontiers of microbiology. Your hand is long healed, but the experience has left you with a much more profound understanding of the human condition. As you stand on the cusp of returning to your own time, you can't help but reflect on the lessons learned from this bizarre and wonderful detour into medical history. What does the story of the Powder of Sympathy really teach us? The first and most obvious lesson is about the immense, often underappreciated, power of the human body to heal itself. In our modern world of aggressive medical interventions, we sometimes forget this fundamental truth. The hero of your story wasn't Sir Kenelm Digby or his magical powder. The hero was your own immune system, which, when given the chance, quietly and efficiently repaired the damage without any fuss. The greatest medical breakthrough in this story was simply getting out of the body's way. It's a powerful reminder of the wisdom inherent in our own biology. The second lesson is about the danger of dogma. For over 500 years, Western medicine was held in a stranglehold by the theories of Galen. His ideas about the four humours were treated not as hypotheses to be tested, but as sacred truths to be memorized. This is why the barber-surgeon was so ready to harm you with his probes and hot irons. He was following the dogma. The story of the powder shows how a charismatic outsider, even one with a completely wrong theory, can sometimes break a destructive paradigm simply by offering a radical alternative. It's a lesson about the importance of questioning authority and being willing to challenge the way things have always been done, even if your reasons for doing so are a bit strange. Third, you've seen a masterclass in the power of storytelling and the placebo effect. The powder's success was built on a narrative, a compelling story that gave people hope, reduced their fear, and mobilized their own internal resources for healing. It teaches us that medicine is never just about chemicals and scalpels, it's also about meaning, belief, and the therapeutic relationship between the healer and the patient. Digby understood, perhaps better than anyone of his time, that how a patient feels about their treatment is a critical part of the treatment itself. This leads to a fascinating and slightly uncomfortable piece of modern context: the persistence of quackery. Even today, in our scientifically advanced age, the market for unproven alternative remedies is massive. People still buy healing crystals, magnetic bracelets, and exotic herbal supplements with little to no scientific evidence to back them up. The story of the Powder of Sympathy helps us understand why. These modern remedies often use the exact same playbook as Digby. They offer a compelling story, a charismatic guru, a sense of taking control, and a rejection of mainstream medicine. They tap into the same deep human need for hope and meaning that made the Powder of Sympathy a 17th century blockbuster. The historical debate here is a philosophical one. What is the ultimate legacy of this episode? Is it a cautionary tale about the dangers of pseudoscience and human gullibility, a story about how easily we can be fooled by clever marketing and our own wishful thinking, or is there a more positive spin? Some historians and medical ethicists argue that the story is also a lesson in medical humility. It reminds us that for a significant portion of history, the best thing a doctor could do for their patient was nothing at all. It forces us to ask which of our own modern, standard medical practices will look as barbaric and nonsensical as bloodletting, or as bizarre as the Powder of Sympathy to people 300 years from now. It's a sobering thought that encourages a healthy dose of skepticism about our own certainty. It teaches us that science is not a body of fixed knowledge, but a process of continuous questioning and self-correction. You look at the world around you. This 17th century landscape of modern magic, faith and filth. It seems so distant, so alien, but the people in it were driven by the same fundamental desires as us, the desire to live, to be free from pain, and to find meaning in a confusing and often frightening world. The Powder of Sympathy, in all its absurdity, was a deeply human response to that universal desire. It was a testament to our species' remarkable capacity for both brilliant insight and beautiful delusion. It was a mistake, yes, but it was a magnificent, instructive, and deeply unforgettable one. The light in the room is changing. The sharp, grey morning light that first woke you in this strange century is softening, giving way to a warm, familiar glow that doesn't belong here. The chaotic symphony of the 17th century street, the clatter of carts, the shouting of vendors, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer is fading. In its place, a low, steady hum begins to rise, a sound so common in your own time you barely notice it. But here, it sounds like the whole world is holding its breath. You are sitting in Sir Kenelm Digby's study once more. The man himself is just a shimmering outline, a memory fading into the light. The books on his shelves, filled with the arcane knowledge of his time, seem to be dissolving, their leather bindings turning to dust and smoke. The skeleton in the corner gives you one last, knowing grin before it vanishes. The silver bowl on his desk, the one that held your splinter, is the last thing to go. For a moment, it catches the fading light, a final, glittering symbol of this entire, absurd adventure. It held the cure that was no cure, the focus of a magical ritual that worked only because it did nothing. It represents the beautiful, intricate, and utterly wrong explanation for your healing. As it dissolves, the last thread connecting you to this world of sympathetic magic is severed. You are no longer in a world governed by the push and pull of invisible sympathies, where healing could be done from a distance and washing a sword was a legitimate medical act. That enchanted world has receded, leaving behind the starker, clearer, and safer reality of the world you know, the one governed by biology, chemistry, and physics, the one with germ theory, antibiotics, and sterile bandages. The journey you took was more than just a trip back in time. It was a journey into a different way of seeing. You walked in a world where the lines we take for granted between science and magic, between mind and body, between an object and its essence were fluid and permeable. For a little while, you lived inside a story, a grand narrative where the universe was a web of hidden meanings. The fear you felt in the barber-surgeon's shop was real. The hope Sir Kenelm gave you was real. The quiet, miraculous healing of your own body was real. Only the explanation was a fiction. But perhaps that's the final, most poignant lesson of all. Sometimes, a good story, even a false one, can be powerful enough to save a life, especially when the truth is too small to be seen and the accepted wisdom is more dangerous than the disease. The transition is gentle, like waking from a long and vivid dream. You can feel the lumpy straw mattress beneath you transforming, becoming the familiar comfort of your own bed. The coarse linen shift you wore is replaced by the soft fabric of your own pajamas. The cold, damp air of 17th century London is gone, replaced by the still, quiet air of your own room. A faint scent of wood smoke and refuse has vanished, leaving only the clean, neutral smell of home. You are back. The adventure is over. The splinter is a ghost. The powder a memory. All that remains is the faint, pink scar on your hand, a tiny souvenir from your time as a case study in one of history's most elegant and instructive mistakes. It's a reminder of the journey, a tiny map of where you've been. You trace its outline with a finger, a silent thank you to your own body, the unsung hero of this strange tale. The hum you hear is just the fan, or perhaps the refrigerator, the quiet background music of your own time. The world outside your window is asleep, resting under the cool, rational light of the moon. And now, the hum of the fan seems to grow a little softer, a little more distant, the edges of your room. The solid lines of the furniture and the frame of the window begin to soften too. The story is over, but the feeling of it lingers, like the warmth of a fire that has just gone out. The voice telling you this tale is also pulling away, becoming just another sound in the gentle fabric of the night. You feel a pleasant weightlessness, as if you are drifting on a calm, dark sea. The details of Sir Kenelm's face or the colour of his strange powder are no longer important. They are just smooth stones sinking into the deep water of your sleep. The little scar on your hand seems to glow for a moment in your mind's eye, a tiny, peaceful star in the darkness. It doesn't represent fear or danger anymore. It's a symbol of resilience, a quiet testament to the magic that is real, the subtle, persistent, and powerful magic of your own body, which works tirelessly in the background, mending and restoring while you rest. Let go of the story now. Let the characters and the centuries drift away like clouds. There is nothing left to figure out, nothing more to learn. There is only the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, a quiet tide pulling you further and further out from the shore of wakefulness. You are safe, you are comfortable, you are falling asleep. The end of the article. Good night.